Dr. Stanley Rosen of Boston University is in Boston, and we are in Washington, and we're going to have another one of those informal conversations we had a number of months ago when we talked to Dr. Rosen about Plato. This time, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, tell me, who are we talking about so we can get the correct pronunciation from you?
Friedrich Nietzsche.
Who was he?
Nietzsche was one of the most extraordinary thinkers and writers of the second half of the 19th century, born in Germany in 1844. He had a relatively brief, productive lifetime. He went mad when he was approximately 45 years old and died in 1900. So we could call him an extraordinary influential thinker and one of the truly great prose writers of German, certainly in the 19th century. That would be my first reply to your question.
And how much have you thought and written about him in your life?
Well, actually, I first started reading Nietzsche when I was an adolescent. And in fact, in my day, that would be almost more than 50 years ago, Nietzsche was not studied really in philosophy departments, and was regarded as a kind of a mad poet rather than a serious thinker. That's interesting because I've kept reading Nietzsche for the next 50 years, and finally his influence caught up with me here in the United States, and he's now one of the most widely read, most influential thinkers of our time. And books pour from the presses on Nietzsche, really quite unusual. So he's had a tremendous impact in the second half of the 20th century in the United States.
Why do you think?
Well, for several reasons. First of all, he's a man of extraordinarily powerful rhetoric. Some people would find the prose in Zarathustra a bit too flowery and passionate. It's written in the style of Luther's translation of the Bible. But his other works are extraordinarily beautiful and really extraordinarily articulate. That's the first reason, his great prowess as a writer. Secondly, however, Nietzsche states in the most powerful way a criticism of the modern epoch, and in particular late modernity, and still more precisely the latter end of the Enlightenment. He states with the greatest power a criticism of that epoch, which has now become rather fashionable. There's a big fight going on, and has been going on almost since the beginning of the Enlightenment, as to whether it was ultimately good or bad. And it would be going too far to say that for Nietzsche it's all bad, but Nietzsche takes the view that what looks to others like progress, scientific progress, technological progress, materialism, egalitarianism, the spread of democracy, even the advent of national socialist, I don't mean by that the Nazis, of course, socialist parties, many people regard that as great progress. Nietzsche saw it as great decadence. And this quarrel within the heart of the Enlightenment is one that has been articulated in the most powerful way by Nietzsche. So if I could add, Brian, one last point that occurs to me. Nietzsche is a prophet of revolution. And to define exactly the content of the revolution that he advocates is not so easy. But one thing that is clear is that Nietzsche is preaching a destruction of traditional values, in particular the values of the Christian tradition, and secondly, but with considerable importance, the values of the Greek philosophers. Nietzsche preaches creativity, originality, uniqueness, self-overcoming, and these have all become extremely popular notions in the 20th century. Think of all the liberation movements in our time. I mean, the black liberation, women's liberation, gay liberation, all the revolutions by young people, which you and I will still remember from, if I'm not giving you too many years, from the Vietnam times. People who wanted to break loose from society, break loose from tradition, reject Christianity, reject the sterility of the middle class and of the bourgeois society, all turned to Nietzsche for solace and for inspiration. Whether he intended to give inspiration to these diverse groups, that's another question. But those are some of the main reasons why Nietzsche is so popular today.
The impetus for asking you to join us again is a Richard Hall, C-SPAN Richard Hall produced event at Bibelow's bookstore near Baltimore in Timonium, where the Philosophy Book Club meets once a month, and at the end of our discussion, we'll show that discussion among everyday citizens talking about philosophy. Let me ask you just a general question. What is the value to people who are adults sitting around talking about philosophy?
Well, now that's a rather difficult question to answer in a simple way. I would say for some people there's no value at all. But those would have to be extremely thoughtless people who are, we're going to exclude them from this discussion. The group that I saw, I looked at parts of the tape, obviously consisted of very bright, concerned people who were interested in understanding themselves and therefore in understanding the structure of the historical period that produced them. And in particular, they were clearly intrigued by the extraordinary power and, I should say, ambiguity of Nietzsche's writings. So, in other words, an intellectual treat, a sheer pleasure, and an essential element in the process that characterizes us as a species, and that is that we want to try to figure out what it means to be a human being and how to live one's life, whether that be the life of a carpenter or an electrician or a physicist or a philosopher is really irrelevant. Ultimately, man, I think, if I may say so, is the philosophical animal. And so in considering philosophy, we are simply exercising our common humanity.
For those who missed our earlier discussion on Plato, would you mind going over the details on Dr. Stanley Rosen? Give us a little background. How long have you mentioned earlier about 50 years of teaching?
Well, it's 50 years of studying philosophy, yeah. I'm a graduate of the old Hutchins College of the University of Chicago, and I went on from there to take my doctorate with the Committee on Social Thought, a very well-known interdisciplinary program that has had many famous people in its faculty. And then I studied in Greece for a year. My wife was an archaeologist at that time. Then came to Penn State University, where I spent 38 years, with a lot of time, taken up by traveling or studying in various places in Europe and the United States. Then I retired in '93 and took a chair at Boston University, where I now am. I'm the Borden Parker Bound Professor of Philosophy and a university professor at Boston University.
How often can we find you in the classroom?
I teach a full load. John Silber, who, as you know, is still the chancellor of BU, wisely, I think, insists that the senior people teach. That's honored. There are one or two exceptions of famous poets or novelists. But the academic people teach a full program, which is 2 courses. And one is a graduate seminar that meets for 3 hours a week. The other is an undergraduate course. As it happens, I'm teaching Nietzsche's Zarathustra this semester. They're largely honor students, about 15 or 20, and that takes 3 hours a week. So it's 6 hours of teaching, plus all the time I spend with my graduate students, reading their dissertations, preparing for classes, and so on.
What do you notice about the undergrad students when they come into the classroom? At what point do they start to understand this stuff?
Again, that depends on the kind of student. If we're talking about the large 150-person classroom, in fact, I've had as many as 350 in a classroom. There, the problem is extremely serious because there are so many people that it's hard to focus their attention. They come from very diverse backgrounds. For most of these kids, philosophy is a 3-hour requirement in humanities. Many of them not at all interested, and they have to be made interested, and the only way to do that is by translating the material into ordinary language, which goes directly to the roots of their daily lives. How deeply those roots go will depend upon how well they respond. So that's one group of students, and I've had some luck with these people. In particular, I found teaching a novel like Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, which is in a way closely connected with some of the themes, although it takes different positions, closely connected with some of the themes in Zarathustra. The real joy, however, is in teaching the kind of course that I'm giving right now to what is essentially a group of honor students, say 20 honor students, who are there because they want to be there. They, in effect, begged me to put them. It was admission by instructor only. And this is wonderful because they're bright, highly intelligent, imaginative, eager to learn. They want to be there. And if I may say so, this might sound peculiar to our audience, they don't know anything. That means that their brains are not obstructed by professionalism, as sometimes happens with senior students or graduate students. They don't already know everything. They don't already have a rich culture. They don't already have a familiarity with the 10 or 15 different interpretations of Nietzsche. And so we can get right down to business and excite them, in a way like in a Platonic dialogue, in which Socrates is talking to young boys who are highly intelligent, and simply they're at that age in which they want to know what it is to be a human being, what is life all about, that kind of thing. So that's very exciting, but that's quite a different experience from the teaching of large introductory classes.
You keep mentioning Zarathustra, and I have here Modern Library Series, Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Yeah.
Fill in a couple blanks for me, and I admit to not having paid a great deal of attention, but the movie came out 2001, Odyssey, years ago. And I think I remember the theme song being Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
That was by Richard Strauss, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It had nothing much to do with Nietzsche. I mean, it was, I did see the movie many years ago, but Strauss wrote a piece which was clearly inspired, he was inspired by Zarathustra. I wouldn't be able to give you a commentary on the piece out of the text, however.
But what I guess my question was, who is Zarathustra?
That's a different matter.
And how does this all fit?
Right. Zarathustra, the figure, is historically a Persian who is reputed to have been the father of moral philosophy. We could put it that way. Philosophy is a bit formal. He was the father of morality, according to that tradition. And Nietzsche chooses him as a prophet of a new morality, which Nietzsche personally is in the process of developing, you see. So Zarathustra is symbolic of the beginning and the end of the long tradition of the Middle East and Western Europe, the long tradition of morality, which Nietzsche is now going to transcend. One of Nietzsche's most famous and I think best books, which he wrote as an attempt to explain Zarathustra, which people found difficult to understand, is called Beyond Good and Evil. Now, the phrase means not that Nietzsche is an immoralist, but that he is an amoralist with respect to the tradition. That is to say, beyond good and evil lies a superior version of goodness and evil. So Zarathustra is a kind of symbolic figure for a shift that is coming. Zarathustra is a prophet of a new morality. And the morality, of course, is the one that Nietzsche articulates sometimes mysteriously, but sometimes with great power in Zarathustra.
Go back to Nietzsche as a person. Again, what year was he born?
1844.
And you remember his exact age when he died?
He died in 1900, but he had been mad for a good 10 years before that.
Where was he kept for those 11 years that he was, or 10 years?
Well, most of the time he was kept at home by his sister, who took care of him. I can't tell you exactly where. He must have died in a hospital. I happened to see his death head in Stockholm. It's very impressive, but I honestly don't remember, where he died. But that was his life was quite tragic. He suffered really from his mid-20s, early 20s, from terrible vision, serious migraine headaches, nausea, and yet he produced 30 or 35 volumes of really gorgeous prose, very deep prose. Always ill, and at the age of 45, he went mad in Italy, and his sister got a hold of him and took him home and took care of him for the remaining 10 years of his life.
Was he married?
No. His relationship with women is not clearly known. I mean, the assumption is that he was entirely chaste, never had any relations with women. He seemed clearly to be in love with a woman named Lou Salome, who also wrote a book about him, a woman of some interest in her own right. But they had intense, it was a kind of a platonic love affair as far as we know. They had intense philosophical discussions. Otherwise, Nietzsche lived a life of almost total solitude. I mean, he spent his life moving from one furnished room to another, changing location in accord with his very bad health, always looking for a place where he could breathe more easily and be freed of his nausea. It was a lonely existence, but one which was spiritually as rich as that of anyone I know in the last 200 years.
Well, if he wrote 35 volumes of material, how much of that do we know sold back then?
Well, Nietzsche didn't sell much at first, but he soon became rather popular, and especially after the, when he was, the 10 years or so when he was already mad, people from all over Europe were beginning to, intelligent and highly artistic people were beginning to discover Nietzsche. His influence grew steadily throughout the first half of the 20th century. I mean, people like D.H. Lawrence, the English novelist, G.B. Shaw, Man and Superman, you know that play, Strindberg, Thomas Mann, the German novelist who moved to the States. Really, the list of people influenced by Nietzsche is endless. Even Sigmund Freud, who denied, incidentally, he denied having studied Nietzsche, clearly was influenced by Nietzsche and borrowed a number of notions from him. So one could say that Nietzsche's influence exploded all over Western Europe, certainly Russia, and North and South America.
You know, if you get on Amazon.com and put in the name Stanley Rosen,
yeah,
you come up with, I don't know, at least 23 different items.
Some of them are written by an imposter who's a specialist in Chinese studies. In other words, there's another Stanley Rosen.
But the point I wanted to make, though, is that you've written a lot, and I've got one of your books here, The Mask of Enlightenment.
Yes.
Which is about Nietzsche's Zarathustra.
Correct.
When did you write this?
The book is a consequence of lectures, graduate seminars that I have been giving on Nietzsche on and off for, I don't know, 20 years. But I actually sat down and put the manuscript together in 1993.
Is it available still? People want to buy it?
Oh, yes. It's published by Cambridge University Press and is easily available.
Now, if let's say 150 years from now, people are looking around and they say, "Oh, there's the Stanley Rosen, the philosopher." Well, is there a Rosen philosophy?
No, not in the sense that I suspect you mean it. I am not one who has built up a system which purports to give the principles of all things, and nor am I in a happy position of being able to clear up all the mysteries of human life. My philosophy, if you want to call it that, is really inspired most by the Platonic Socrates. I'm a man who, like many others, has devoted his life to examining fundamental questions, fundamental principles, and trying to understand how these fundamental principles have been spelled out in the history of philosophy and the shape that they've taken in our own time and what every age has crises. We have our crises, and I've tried to find my bearings and to help my students to find their bearings with respect to these philosophical crises. So in short, many of my books, not all, but many of my books are about somebody else. I've written books about Plato or Hegel or Nietzsche. I've written books about Heidegger and so on. And that's not because I'm a pure philologist or scholar, but because I believe that philosophy must be studied in the context of its development from the beginning, because it's not like science in which only the latest results count, and what happened previously has been transcended. Since I don't believe that there are any final answers to the deepest human questions, I think it would be really quite foolish to reject the thoughts of the wisest members of our race. So that's the rough story of where I stand on philosophy.
I don't know if this works or not, but if Nietzsche were here today, based on what you know, and this may sound like I'm reaching, but what would he think of the discussion in this country ongoing, at least the history of this network, 21 years, on abortion?
God.
I mean, how would it fit into his morality?
I honestly, can't give you a direct answer to that question. It doesn't come up in so many words. We would have to reconstitute a position for Nietzsche, and I would say there that for Nietzsche the issue of abortion is not, as it is for most of us today, or at least that's the way in which the issue is argued today, is, as you put it, a moral question. In other words, is a fetus a living being? At what age? At what stage of the fetus, the development of the fetus? Does the soul, religious people talk, manifest itself? You see what I mean? It's a moral question. For Nietzsche, it would be a political question. That is to say, Nietzsche would ask, if we are going to something like this, if we are going to produce a race of what he calls in Zarathustra supermen, funny expression. In fact, the standard translator, Walter Kaufman, calls it Overman, because he doesn't want people to get mixed up with the comic strip character, you know, Clark Kent. However, to try to answer your question by some kind of indirect construction, if our goal is to produce a superior race, then abortion in principle is not to be rejected by Nietzsche. For example, let me give you an example from Plato. In Plato's Republic, reproduction is very carefully restricted by class. In other words, the most intelligent, superior people must breed only among themselves. Suppose a member of the most intelligent or highest class of philosopher kings, as they're called, guardians, suppose one of them breeds with somebody from the lower classes, the workers. That child will be exposed on birth, or aborted if it's discovered before it's born. The reason for that is that for Plato in the Republic, in order to have a superior city, you must have a superior ruling class. And Plato knew, or thought he knew, from the process of breeding dogs and breeding animals, that people could be bred in the same way, and that you had to have the children of superior parents as members of the highest class. Now, that's Plato, but I mentioned it because it really casts a bit of light on the answer to what Nietzsche would have said. I mean, Nietzsche, I don't think, would have had any interest in aborting children for the convenience of the mother. I mean, again, this issue is played out, you know, in terms in the United States which would not be applicable to understanding Nietzsche's own position. But we can summarize this line of thought as follows. Whether children are allowed, infants are allowed to live or die, is a political decision, and that in turn is made on the basis of the intrinsic splendor of the culture and values of the civilization that we're building. And you might say, well, isn't some people would say, isn't abortion itself a defect of our civilization? And Nietzsche would say no, in my opinion. You know, if you ask someone else, you might get a different answer. But I think Nietzsche would say no. He would say that's sentimentality. That comes ultimately from Christianity. Now, there are many people who are not Christians who are opposed to abortion. Nietzsche would have called that secularized Christianity. In other words, the Christian morality transformed into a morality for non-believers, but people who have still been influenced by Christianity. He would have said the same thing about socialism, for example, as a kind of secularized Christianity. So is that helpful at all?
Yeah. What would he have said if he were here at the table this morning? What would he say about the fact that this is one of the largest church-going countries in the world, or the highest percentage of people in the world that go to church, and also what would he say about our democracy?
Nietzsche would, you know Karl Marx's famous phrase, religion is the opiate of the masses? Mm-hmm. Well, for Nietzsche, look, I can answer you in this way. Nietzsche wished to destroy Christianity and replace it with another religion, a religion of the superior human being. In other words, Nietzsche's teaching is a very radical, extremely rhetorical version of what's been going on in modern Western Europe for the last 300 years. I mean, it's a kind of carrying out of Descartes, the French philosopher and mathematician's statement in his Discourse on Method, that science, and with it the correct philosophy, will enable human beings to become as masters and possessors of nature. That was back in the 17th century. Now, obviously, if we become masters and possessors of nature, that means that we throw out the previous master and possessor, and that's God. So, I mean, there's an intrinsic atheistic element in modernity, and in particular in the modern philosophical tradition. That's not to say that all modern people are atheists, but that has to be recognized. Nietzsche is another one, as was Marx, of those people who wishes to allow for the development of a superior human being. And in order to do that, he sees that we have to destroy the culture that has produced the previous human beings. So that's one part of my reply to you. Now, what does religion have to do with this? Well, the previous religion, let's just call it Christianity, must be destroyed because the values of Christianity have been a major ingredient, if not the major ingredient, in the preparation of corrupt people. I mean, now let's put some flesh on those bones so that your audience can know exactly what Nietzsche didn't like. He did not like weakness. He did not like pacifism. He did not like egalitarianism. He did not like Jesus turning the other cheek. He did not like Jesus appealing to the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and the halt. He saw Christianity, if I may put it colloquially, as a religion for losers. He wanted to inculcate a spirit of warrior-like creativity, of people who would not be bound by sentimentality for the average person or for the inferior person or for the disadvantaged, as we call them today. To Nietzsche, this would have all been sentimentality. So he would not at all have been impressed by the fact that we're all going to church. The second point you asked about was democracy. Now, this is interesting, Brian, because Nietzsche today is extraordinarily popular, not simply among right-wing thinkers, but among left-wing thinkers as well. I mentioned earlier in this discussion that there are, our century, the 20th century, has been one of any number of liberation groups. It's also been a century of the spread of democracy. It's been a century of the spread of ideas of egalitarianism, fairness, and so on. I mean, these are terms that intellectuals in London or Belgrade, as we now see with excitement on the television, or New York, all use with equal frequency. Nietzsche was really opposed to that. I mean, Nietzsche was what I would call a revolutionary of the right. He is confused by, I think, many well-meaning people from the left because he's confused as a spokesman for their views, because he talks a great deal about uniqueness and creativity and individuality and so on. But what he meant by that was that the Superman would have to create a new civilization such that the non-creative people, namely the great majority, would benefit simply by participating in it. In other words, by exemplifying the values of Nietzsche's morality, which would replace Christ's morality. I mean, from a Christian standpoint, Christians are obedient to the teaching of Christ. Nietzsche wishes to replace the teaching of Christ by his own teaching. One of the books that he wrote was called The Antichrist. The last work he wrote, Ecce Homo, you know, it's a biblical expression, behold the man. Nietzsche, quite seriously, saw himself as a great historical rival to Christ. That was his ambition, to replace everything having to do with Christianity. And democracy, unfortunately, for our own tastes, from Nietzsche's standpoint, democracy was inferior. It was a kind of version of the sentimentality that one sees exemplified in Christianity. So those are my answers. They're not very pleasant, I'm afraid, to contemporary taste, but those are the answers. Now, may I add that if you have 5 other people on your program, you might get 5 different answers. I don't think it's that they would be right. I mean, I think that Nietzsche was not a liberal. He was not a revolutionary in the left sense of the term. He was a man who believed in rank ordering. As he often said, my key concept is rank ordering. He was a man who believed in the nobility of the spirit. He despised the rabble, the people, the crowd, as he called them variously. He wished them no harm. On the contrary, he wished to raise them up. But the only way in which they could be raised up is by being trained properly, if I can put it that way. I'm speaking for Nietzsche, not myself. The only way in which the people could be raised up is by being given a proper education. I mean, this is not a notion that is foreign to us today. But the content of the education that they would be given would be quite different from the one that obtains in modern 20th century European democracies. So, in short, anti-religious in the traditional sense, and by no means, in no sense of the term, a Democrat, as that word is used in contemporary political discussion.
Professor Stanley Rosen, who teaches at Boston University, is in Boston talking with us about Friedrich Nietzsche, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And he'll be with us for about another 25 minutes or so, and we're leading up to watching the philosophy book group that meets monthly at the Bebelows bookstore in Timonium, which is up near Baltimore, about 45 miles from where we are here in Washington. I want to ask you, why should we care what this man thinks? And who has made him someone that you read and think about?
His extraordinary influence. And when I say that, I don't mean that the influence necessarily worked out as he had intended it. But Nietzsche states in the most effective way that I'm familiar with the following view. Traditional philosophy, traditional morality is all a lie. Life is in fact chaos. That is to say, intrinsically it's chaos. Whatever order exists in the world has been produced by human beings. Orders are born, live, mature, grow old, and die just like individual people. When an order, a political order or a social order or a set of values a society, historical epoch, all of these terms amount to much the same thing. When such a structure begins to get old and to deteriorate, then it leads to what Nietzsche calls decadence, I mean decay. And if the decadence is allowed to proceed untreated, you could make a medical analogy here. In other words, if you have a tumor and you don't treat it, then it's going to spread throughout the body politic, and it's going to deteriorate the standards and the values of the civilization. And this will be a long, drawn-out process in which people will become more and more decadent and more mediocre. Consequently, what we have to do, that is to say what a man like Nietzsche has to do, is to destroy that civilization. And he states very radically the need to destroy tradition. And that is very appealing. I mean, the 20th century is a century still of revolutions. And he also speaks very, very clearly about the inadequacy of moral teachings which restrain us. And people who don't wish to be restrained by moral teachings, who don't wish to be, as they would put it, slaves of a supernatural being, find something extremely appealing in Nietzsche. Nietzsche was influential in bad ways, very bad ways. For example, he influenced, not intentionally, but the Nazis were influenced by Nietzsche. I mean, there are horrifying passages in Zarathustra. One passage about the blonde beast who will come down from the north, you know, into the plains of the Mediterranean and destroy the mongrel races that are living there. I mean, that's, you know, Hitler and his propagandists made use of passages of that sort. Because Nietzsche, as part of Nietzsche's teaching about the Superman, there was a kind of biological Superman, the notion of a biological Superman, of a being of enormous strength and health. Nietzsche himself was quite sick, as I mentioned earlier, and people have speculated, you know, that he had a kind of almost desperate romantic interest in and enthusiasm for health because of his own miserable physical existence. However that may be, Nietzsche had influences which, depending upon your own political standpoint, were either good or terrible, but they were enormous. And one has to understand, I think, you know, the conditions of one's own time, and one can only understand that by studying the great masters, people like Nietzsche, who prepared the time in which we live. Is that a helpful answer to your question?
Yeah, but could you do this? And this may be a little bit harder. Who in this country today that we know, or maybe a better profile of the person, would be walking around with "Thus spoke Zarathustra" in their pocket as kind of their Bible? Can you define the kind of person, the kind of thinker today?
Well, again, I have to begin by emphasizing that Nietzsche is sufficiently difficult to understand and sufficiently ambiguous that he's inspired people of widely disparate views. So you could find, using this terminology of the left and the right, not in any polemical way, but simply because I think everyone's familiar with it, you will find people on the right who are very impressed with Nietzsche's critique of Christianity as a kind of religion of, as I put it earlier, losers, a religion which weakens the distinction between the noble and the base, which turns our attention from the high to the low.
Let me jump in to ask, when you say the right wing, but
yeah,
would right-wing born-again Christians feel that way?
No, I doubt that they'd ever heard of Nietzsche, but I mean...
well, would they agree with his discussion?
Well, let me give you a specific example. Perhaps one of the 2 or 3 most famous philosophers of the 20th century, a man named Martin Heidegger, dead for some years, German philosopher who wrote a great deal on Nietzsche and who shared Nietzsche's distaste for modernity and for many, if not all, of the same reasons. I don't think that you would find Jerry Falwell appealing to Nietzsche because Nietzsche is an antichrist. But those people who saw themselves as freed or wishing to be freed from the traditional forms of Judeo-Christianity, or for that matter Islam, those who in particular saw themselves as wishing to be freed from Christianity would find Nietzsche extremely appealing. Now, who are the people who wish to be freed from Christianity, just to follow out the single thought? Well, they can be on the left or the right, right? I mean, there are right-wing atheists and there are left-wing atheists. Left-wing atheists, I mean by that, again, nothing abusive, but people who believe that man makes his own values and we must respect each individual person, and we must be fair and just to everyone, and there is no single point of view that is truly right. Religion and even many philosophies are therefore quite dogmatic, and that leads to a notion of a kind of an egalitarian democracy. Now, these people could find themselves using Nietzsche to justify some or all of their views. Sometimes they would be right, sometimes they would be wrong. Nietzsche was anti-Christian, but he was not a Democrat. So one has to reply to you rather cautiously. You could find admirers of Nietzsche in almost every sector of the intellectual world. And that's why the cumulative effect of Nietzsche's writing has been so powerful.
Go back to when he lived. Did he have parents alive when he was doing all this?
His father died at a relatively early age. His mother lasted longer. And he, however, once he passed, you know, he was a university professor in his early 20s. And then just went off on his own. He knew he had a mission. He had to write these books. And he wanted complete independence. He had a very small pension. And I think his mother sent him some money. He was extremely poor, you know, by any normal standard, but he had just enough to live on. And he preferred to live alone. He didn't live with his family.
Where did he, well, first of all, where was he born?
He was born in Germany, a village called Röcken, a little village, I think that's the name. And he went to school in, he went to what we would call a classical gymnasium, that's to say, what we would call a high school, something like that. Then he got a job teaching in Switzerland, in Basel. He was a professor there. But for various reasons, one of which was his health, he gave that up at quite an early age and took his small pension and whatever money he got from his family and proceeded to spend the next 20 years writing these thousands and thousands of pages in one small furnished room after another, many of them in mountain areas in Switzerland. He ended up, for example, in northern Italy. He went mad in Torino, which still has a sign on the house that he lived in, you know, in the final days of his sanity.
And how, I think I've read either in your book or somewhere that syphilis was the cause of his insanity?
That's, if I'm not mistaken, that's the consensus view of the medical people. He was himself a medical orderly in the war of Franco-Prussian War, you know. He served as a medical orderly, and apparently he got infected while treating somebody. Medicine obviously was not as advanced as it is today. He apparently got infected from someone who had syphilis and got it, and the result was paresis. Now, no one knows this. No one knows for absolute certainty that Nietzsche did not contract syphilis, you know, directly. But that's the story that I think is currently accepted.
Now, what was his relationship with Richard Wagner, the composer?
Yes. At a rather early age, he attracted Wagner's attention, and they became rather good friends. Wagner was a very tyrannical man, rather nasty bit of goods, if I may say so, anti-Semite, and lots of faults, quite an egomaniac. But he liked Nietzsche because he saw Nietzsche's genius, and Nietzsche revered Wagner in the early stages of their friendship. He revered Wagner and thought of him as an artist of universal competence who would be able to produce works of art that would contribute to, you know, the elevation of the spiritual development of European man. At a certain point, however, when Wagner became extremely sentimental and celebrating Christian elements in his operas, Nietzsche became disgusted with him and broke with him. And he wrote a book called The Fall of Wagner. And Wagner became extremely irritated with him, and their relations were ruptured. But Nietzsche apparently retained a lifelong respect for the influence that Wagner had had on him, and he also liked Wagner's wife very much, Cosima. It's interesting that a man who lived this life of complete isolation, he had one or two male friends, but the two people who made, I would say, the greatest impression on him as human beings were Lou Salome and Cosima Wagner, who were both women. Richard Wagner, to be sure, but only for a short period of time.
You know, today, if you were to analyze the success of a lot of people in our society, you would always go back and find the great mentioners, whether it's politics or philosophy or professors or entertainers. I mean, somebody somewhere mentions people, and that's how the whole thing begins. If you went back in his life, when would you find people starting to mention Friedrich Nietzsche? Was he discussed in the papers? Was he discussed by others publicly? When did he come into the public being where people all started to say, this is somebody you got to read?
Yes, I would say that began in the period, oddly and sadly enough, after his, during his madness and after his death. In other words, 1890, 1910, thereabouts, Nietzsche began to become an international figure.
Who did it?
Well,
Who made him?
Some of the people whom I mentioned earlier, Strindberg and Shaw, great variety of writers and artists.
Who's doing it now?
Now Nietzsche is the hottest item in publishing. One of my publishers, editors, told me once that we could publish a book called Nietzsche's Laundry List, and it would still sell 5,000 copies.
Why?
Well, it would be difficult for me to answer that without repeating many of the things I said before.
Yeah, but I mean, is there are professors in schools like yourself saying you got to got to study this guy?
Yes. I mean, Nietzsche is extraordinarily popular. I think perhaps the best answer I can give you is this: it was the influence of Martin Heidegger, whom I mentioned previously, that really led to the explosion in our generation. In other words, Heidegger published his major work on Nietzsche in 1960. And Heidegger was a man of world influence, and he influenced in particular a school of French thinkers who are variously known as postmodernists or deconstructionists, people like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, to mention the most familiar names. And these people were very much influenced by Heidegger, and through Heidegger, by Nietzsche. And they spread the picture of a revolutionary, what I was calling earlier, I hope not in any confrontational manner, I was calling a left-wing Nietzsche. And this became extremely popular in the United States. I can also indicate it to you in the following way. In the American academic philosophical community, for, let us say, 50 or 70 years, philosophy was dominated by people with strong interests in science, mathematics, people who regarded themselves as analytical thinkers rather than synthetic thinkers with broad visions of human life. Now, to be quite candid about it, except for the professionals themselves, the students are not interested in this sort of thing. And many people who are not professional philosophers, but who are academicians, are looking for something richer than no matter how wonderful it may be in itself, the analysis, precise analysis of concepts, structure of mathematical arguments, and so forth. That doesn't give you a lot to live on. And Nietzsche gave us an extraordinary portrait of human existence. I mean, we've managed to cover, only the most exciting and notorious aspects of the teaching of Zarathustra. But in Nietzsche's 30 volumes, you will find discussions of world literature, of the Greeks, endless discussions of Greek civilization, Greek archaic civilization. You will find elaborate, not always philologically accurate, but nevertheless elaborate criticisms of German philosophy of the 18th and 19th centuries. All of this, this extraordinarily gorgeous prose, this very provocative writing, these wonderful observations on Stendhal and on Heinrich Heine and on political events and on human psychology. And I'll end that with this point. Nietzsche was a master psychologist. And this is, among other things, an age of psychology, the age of anxiety, the age of Freud and Jung and so on. And Nietzsche there, too, is one of the great, great psychologists. When he discovered Dostoevsky, incidentally, he said that Dostoevsky was the other great psychologist. I mean, if you think of novels like The Brothers Karamazov and The Idiot and so on, Nietzsche liked that very much. This extremely fine-grained, exaggerated obsession with the subtleties of the human psyche. Nietzsche is just marvelous on that. I mean, he really gives wonderful portraits of human types. And this is mother's milk to 20th century intellectuals.
Stanley Rosen, of all your books that you've written over the years, which ones sold the best?
Well, actually, the one that's selling the best by far is a book that I edited for the Book of the Month Club, and Random House did the trade edition. It's called The Examined Life. And I won't try to describe it in any detail. But of my own monographs or philosophical works, I believe it's correct to say that a work called Nihilism has done the best. That was published many years ago by Yale Press and is now out again, reprinted by St. Augustine Press. I would guess the Nihilism book.
How many of your books are still in print?
All of them.
So you can buy everything that you've written?
Everything I've written.
That's unusual, isn't it?
Well, I've been very fortunate. I have a contract with the St. Augustine Press, which commits them to bringing into print everything of mine that has gone out of print. So they've reprinted 4 or 5 titles of mine, you know, which after 20 years went out of print.
Who are they? Who's the St. Augustine Press?
That's an outfit located in Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, and they publish, they reprint scholarly, philosophical, religious books, which have gone out of print, but which, you know, still command a certain audience. And they do a bit of original publications. I think they intend to expand that side of the thing. But they've brought a wide range of philosophical works back into print and plan to keep them there. It's now not so difficult, I gather. I can't explain all of the technicalities, but apparently new techniques of producing books enable publishers to keep them in print longer than was the case previously. So yes, I have been very lucky. They're all in print.
Our book TV producer, Richard Hall, is responsible for putting this all together, and in a few moments we're going to see a discussion by a group called the Philosophy Book Group, meeting at Bibelow's bookstore in Timonium, Maryland. They meet every month. It's just north of Baltimore. And they met on August the 28th for that was actually 7 days after the 100th anniversary of Nietzsche's death. You've seen this tape, Professor?
I saw about 15 minutes of it, yes.
What's your sense? I didn't count the number of people there, but probably, what, 20 people in the room at least?
It was a larger crowd, I thought, than the one we did, than the one that was discussing the Republic. I had the impression it was a bigger room and a larger crowd. Maybe 15 people. Yeah, that sounds right.
And what did you think when you watched the 15 minutes of it?
Well, I was fascinated, as always. I would say this. These people got exactly right how dangerous Nietzsche is. Those of your audience who will stay with the show, you know, and watch the discussion will see that come out quite clearly. The people understood clearly that Nietzsche is a dangerous man.
Why is he dangerous?
Well, because he's teaching us to destroy tradition, to create new values. That's always dangerous. He's not a Democrat. I think they saw that very clearly, for the most part. For all in other words, the reasons that I gave before, they perceived those. Where they went wrong, to the extent that they did go wrong, is that there was a tendency on the part of some of the members of the club to interpret Nietzsche to be saying that every individual must create his or her own values. You see, that would be too democratic an interpretation of Nietzsche. It would also, from his standpoint, and frankly from mine, lead to complete chaos. Nietzsche was not teaching that every individual person create his or her own values. What he was teaching is that the great person, the Superman, create a new set of values which will be disseminated down by teaching and other modes of influence into the multitude and thereby raise them up. I don't think they quite got that right. A third point that interested me was that they seemed to feel, or at least a vocal segment of the group seemed to feel, that Nietzsche was very cynical. Now, that's not the right word. I hope I'm not misperceiving them. I think that's what they said. Nietzsche is ironical, and he has a wonderfully complicated sense of humor, and he doesn't share many illusions of the average person. But he's not cynical. A cynical person I take to be someone, I mean, at least in the current usage of the term, a cynical person is someone who really doesn't believe in anything and wants to cast doubt on everything and is a kind of a destroyer rather than a creator. You see, from Nietzsche's standpoint, cynicism is dissatisfaction of a powerless sort. You know, we just make fun of things. What Nietzsche does is to make fun of things in order to destroy them so that the ground can be cleared for him to create something new. So I think these people perceive something. In other words, they notice that Nietzsche is an ironic and in many ways an entertaining writer, but he's not cynical. They took his violent denunciations of democracy, his invocation to war, his statements that blood will flow in the streets, that the blonde beast will come down, and so on. They took that as a kind of cynicism, if I understood them correctly, towards humanity in general. And that's not quite the way I would describe it. Cynicism is not quite the right word.
From what you know of him, if he had to live in this time and had to do the circuit, the television shows and all that stuff and the lecture series, what would people think of him before he became mad?
Well, he was a great gentleman. I mean, it's an interesting contrast, you know, this man who who advocates violence and wrote one book. True, many people think he was mad when he wrote it. Ecce Homo, Behold the Man. One chapter is called I Am Dynamite, and section is called Why I Write Such Wonderful Books. I mean, he was really obsessed with himself. He knew his own greatness, you know. I mean, there was no, I wouldn't call it, well, there was no false modesty in Nietzsche. On the other hand, as a person, from all the accounts that we have, and you know, many people have left their reminiscences of encounters with Nietzsche, he was a gentleman. He was extremely gentle, which is a separate term, not just a gentleman in the sense of having polished manners, but he was a gentle person. I mean, I don't think he could have hurt a fly. He was very considerate of other people and very quiet and I think quite engaging and could be good fun, you know, at parties. Was a very witty person. I think people would like him, provided that the that the interviewer did not go on to ask for further details of Nietzsche's philosophical positions, because once those came out in our time, if they came out, in other words, if my interpretation of Nietzsche is correct, Nietzsche's statements would be regarded with horror by most intellectuals and thinking people in the present social and political circumstances. So he was one of these prophets of violence who was himself an extremely quiet man. That was apparently not true of Karl Marx. I mean, I'm not a big expert on Marx's life, but I do know that he was a rather disagreeable and nasty fellow. No one could have said that about Nietzsche. Nietzsche was extremely nice.
By the way, in case people have just joined us, Stanley Rosen, who teaches at Boston University, has written this book that's in print called The Mask of Enlightenment, Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Did Zarathustra live?
I don't think anyone knows. I mean, it's just one of those legendary figures.
So just, when did Nietzsche, did he make up the, is it?
No. I mean, it's a traditional figure from ancient Persian mythology. The ostensible inventor of morality. There might have been a man who did this. I wouldn't know.
When you're teaching Nietzsche,
yeah,
what do you find the reaction of your students to be to him after they've had a lot of him?
Some of them are repelled by him for reasons that will be clear to anyone who's been listening to this interview. But on the whole, I find that the students are excited by Nietzsche. And, you know, the reasons are various, but Nietzsche is just an extremely exciting guy. For example, I found, to my great interest, years ago I used to try to teach Kierkegaard, whom many people sort of link, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad reasons, with Nietzsche. He lived somewhat earlier than Nietzsche. Kierkegaard was a very exciting writer, was a brilliant epigrammatist and a critic of the establishment. He was a religious writer. The students don't go for him. They don't like him. Nietzsche appeals. Nietzsche is interesting. There is something about Nietzsche that excites students, and it certainly is his invocation to go to the heart of things, not to be bound by tradition, to understand or to try to understand what it means to be a human being, and the various emphases upon creativity and self-overcoming. A lot of the students like it, but some, a significant minority, are repelled and frightened by it.
Dr. Rosen, I'm sorry we're out of time, and
right.
We really appreciate you spending time with us and telling us all about this, and thank you and good luck up there at Boston University, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Brian, so much for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Next, we go to Timonium, Maryland for a discussion of Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoken Zarathustra. The book was written in 4 parts by the German philosopher between 1883 and 1885. First published as a whole book in 1892, the work is a set of parables about a prophet who proclaims the death of God. The discussion's about 2 hours.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to the Be Below philosophy book discussion. I don't know if any of you know it, but last Saturday was the 100th anniversary of Nietzsche's death. I think you'd be puzzled but gratified to see a turnout like this for talk about his. That's true. I think his most personal work, seems to, judging from his letters, it was the work he cared most deeply about. It was the work that he felt revealed himself the most, and the work that he thought would introduce him to the general public. You know, he was great hopes for it, very anxious about it too, very anxious about its reception. I was afraid it would come across as a bit of literary entertainment. And I think that accounts for the strangeness of the work. And yes, I'd like to ask you, if any of you wondered if you were reading philosophy, reading Thus Spake Zarathustra, or did you have, or was there anything in the book that you particularly struck you? Any passages that puzzled you particularly? I'd awfully like to hear from you what your reactions were to, I think, a very unusual work.
I thought I was reading a new theology.
Okay.
Where he, emphasizing creation, created another story about Jesus Christ. He has his own Jesus Christ. And the story that man tells is very different from the traditional stories that Jesus Christ would have told. He uses some of the same scenery from the Bible, but the impact is totally different.
Okay. Can you think of an example of biblical?
Remember the sailors who say they see him in the air, and then the next passage, I believe, he's on the boat with them, and they're frightful. And I recall that from the Bible, but I don't remember too good from the Bible, but I recall that story. And he uses that. He uses different numbers that are associated with the Bible, the 7 days.
7 seals.
But wasn't he using that technique to really contradict Christianity? He wasn't supporting Christianity. He was refuting Christianity. He thought it was a weakness of man. Religion or morals are a weakness in man, not a strength. And he was using the structure of the New Testament sort of as a way of refuting the New Testament, not supporting it.
No, he wasn't supporting it. Because I say he created his Jesus Christ.
But as a counter to Jesus Christ.
Right, it's different from the traditional
right,
Jesus Christ.
But I mean purposely sort of opposite of Christ. That's what I mean.
Well, I think that's opposite because his very basic premise is that God is dead.
Right.
And that there is nothing higher than human. The highest element he would speak of as the overman, or the Übermensch, who is beyond human beings, or at least have attained a very high level. But some of the same things that he says are the things that Jesus said. The idea of to be strong is to be humble. And his picture of the overman is one who has the courage to be humble.
Wouldn't he agree that God is for that man? God is dead for people who, like monks, or go in the forest and don't circulate in society. But the strong man, the healthy man, has his God, a God who protects the healthy openness of man and strength, the Superman, really. And the man who conceives of God as being something that you take in the forest and you pray and you become very withdrawn from society. Yes, for him the God is dead.
Yeah.
See, I would like to present another consideration, that the issue isn't so much God, the issue is the individual.
Yes, I agree.
That we have the opportunity to create our own lives and should not depend upon someone else, whether it be a vision of a God or any kind of protector. So I don't personally think that he was disclosing his personal values. I think he was only saying that you, in essence, have to have your own. He may very well have thought God was special to him, but it was his decision, and the purpose of his writing this book isn't so much to tell people what he thinks, but just to tell them to think for themselves.
Of course.
So
And
he isn't saying
and
literally
I think
God
he
is
was-
dead. He's just saying God as a figurehead, is someone you
would
count
say
on
we
rather
are-
than be your own
we are
person.
free to become
Isn't there for
ourselves.
you.
I think he would say we are free to become ourselves because God is dead. That we don't have this authority figure that looms over us and says, this is what you must do. And he saw that in the
But I think
organized
it's a
church.
symbolism rather than the reality. We don't really know whether or not he had a God based on this reading. We just know that he's trying to promote that concept for people so that they can be their own creator. At least that's my impression.
I'd like to go back to Ted's original question and follow up what you're talking about. He asked if this was a philosophy or literature. I'm not too sure Nietzsche was writing philosophy. I mean, I always think of philosophy as being more coherent. You know, this follows this. There's a tremendous amount of ambivalence here. And I'd like to then follow, keeping that in mind. What is the source of ethics, then, if indeed we say we no longer have this, this deity to worry us? We are free. Of course, the idea of him being a prophet saying, do this is oxymoronic. I mean, you know, to do this is a command, you know, and my command is don't listen to me, which is kind of oxymoronic. But where is his source of ethics in this? Where does he refer? Is it just simply our whim? Is this going to be the finality of all our decisions philosophically? Is I have a whim to do this, therefore
But
I have
isn't it
great will.
interesting that he doesn't tell us that? I think it's on purpose that he doesn't tell us his source of ethics, because he clearly wants us to have our own, from our own heart and soul. We're not going to really know his ethics based on reading this. We're only going to know that he promotes that you have your own ethics.
Could I beg the eternal recurrence? Could I ask you to comment on that as a source of ethics? Possibly Nietzsche's source of ethics is this eternal recurrence, which to me sounds awful. Sounds like
Richard, could you say a little more about it so people have a bit of a context?
Well, for one thing, Nietzsche wasn't real sure what he was talking about, and you know, when you read this, it's very vague, and scholars have argued this, but in essence, everything is being repeated exactly and precisely over and over and over again. It's Groundhog Day, you know, over and over and over and over again. So if you can do something in this life that would make life the same thing's going to occur, but if you have the correct, using a modern term, the correct attitude, then life will become very pleasant, even though the same things are occurring. So there's an obligation on the part of the individual to make life pleasant, because this is occurring again and again and again.
I don't know if the issues make life pleasant.
Yeah,
Just take responsibility and put your heart into what you're doing, because it could happen over and over and over again. And approach life as if that's really going to happen over and over again. And if you approach life that way, perhaps you will be very conscious of who you are and what you promote as a person.
See, that little thing that you said, as if. Now, is it really an as if, or is it? No.
Oh, I think it's clearly an as if.
Okay. So that's a little difference in the way you would approach your morals, and I'll believe this as if, or I believe it is.
I can't imagine he was saying any different than that.
Okay.
There's no other indication in his writing that he believed in all kinds of lies and stuff.
Eternal occurrence, I've read explained in a very different way. Not that he believed in repetitive, you know, like a cyclical repetition, but that he believed in more of like an eternal now concept, where everything that's happened up to this moment has built upon every previous moment, and therefore every moment is in effect a recurrence of the previous moments. So it's as though it's a repetition, but it's really not a repetition, because each moment is slightly different, but basically it's a recurrence.
You mean it's
Because
sort of a summing up of what's happened?
Right, it's a summing up, going all the way back to the creation. I can't believe that Nietzsche believed in a cyclical recurrence, as I think you stated, because he was too bright of a person for that.
Well, I think he
had
did. In fact, I think in absolute terms, he believed that everything would recur in a cycle, if you like, and therefore there is no real death.
But what
Just
basis?
as you
By
might,
what basis? This
on
is
what,
the question.
First of all, I don't know if he understood biology, but certainly there's no real death in biology. There's just cyclical events, and there's certainly in the cosmos there's just expansion and contraction. So I don't know where his science was, but to clarify some other things, I think there's no question that he believed that there was no transcendental ideal or God is dead, and therefore, as you say, the individual must take over. And I think there's a problem because he also said, and I don't have it exactly, but that all antitheses work simultaneously, and that's not even a paraphrase, but that's my language. In other words, the old Aristotelian idea of either or is not going to work anymore. Both and will work. So one can't exclude his unconscious mutterings, but then again, one can't totally include them either. So that a society or an individual has to pick and choose at the moment, but that all may be true and valid.
See, the question about where his moral standard or basis comes from, I think that's the big question. And I think to assume that Nietzsche actually believed in this eternal recurrence as a cyclical thing is selling him very short. He knew of, in his time, I mean, he was well educated to his time. He knew of Darwin. He understood all of that. So the whole notion of this old Hindu type belief in this recurrence, I just can't believe that he would ever have believed that.
Are there other books that address this more so than
Yes,
this particular one? Maybe we shouldn't be focusing on this too much because that's not
let
the
me
focus of this book.
suggest another approach. What difference does this make to your ethics, whether you believe in an eternal return or you believe in a kind of a straight line of existence?
As to his morality, I believe that he would say that the unconscious readout of the primitive in me as a leader-ruler would be the ethical and virtuous stance that I might have, that to be weak and humble and considerate of my fellow man is a stance of slavery and will not result in new paradigms being created or imagined, and will result in a kind of stasis and therefore to be rejected. I think uncontrovertibly he says that over and over again.
Well, it gets rid of that very sloppy thing called Judgment Day. So,
Well, yeah. And two
I mean, it
things-
really does. I mean, it's a very, to him, that's an obnoxious thing. You know, the idea that.
Or can we say that conversely, every day is Judgment Day? Is that fair to say?
Maybe
Because you
Resolution
have a-
Day, but not
because you have a responsibility to make something out of every day. Does that make every day Judgment Day, or does that make no day Judgment Day?
I think every day is overcoming day.
And overcoming is really examining, not
that's
succeeding.
I like that. It's an over.
Judgment is.
Well,
as
any
he's
talk
concerned.
of Nietzsche and ethics, rules, and all is anathema. He is very clear that these rules, morality, ethics, are the refuge of the weak. And that, you know, we should trust simply the healthy attitude that we're living now, and that life is open and full, and that morals don't matter. Ethics doesn't matter. It don't matter.
Isn't that an ethic, what you just said?
What?
Isn't that an ethic, what you just espoused? Is the idea that we are strong, we are living, the earth belongs to the living, we do. That sounds like a pretty strong ethics.
And the beauty of the way he covers this or doesn't cover it is the two things that he continues to emphasize are happiness and silence, neither of which can be defined. And that's the beauty of it. He doesn't want you to know what the ethics are. He doesn't want you to know what the things are. He wants you to make it for yourself, not for everybody else. So the issue of happiness, the issue of silence, neither one of those can be clearly defined per se. They're individually interpreted.
Yes.
And that's all he's really getting at.
Okay.
Yeah. You are
The
your own
methods-
judge.
That's right.
And ethics will have to be relative.
That's right. That's exactly what he's saying.
Well, his
Well,
word's
that gets in a lot of
transitory.
trouble.
Anybody notice? The word he uses for ethics is good and evil. You don't have it right unless you recognize that good and evil are transitory, something to that effect. And,
Well, but you mean that they come and go?
yes.
And what do you mean by evil, or isn't that something that you conceive? In other words, you conceive the good, you conceive the evil, and they come and go. What's the ground? Where can you stand if you your sense of evil, your sense of goodness come and go? Isn't the basis the strong life that don't take refuge in rules or concepts of humility or helping this one or helping the weak and all? Why, of course you do those things, but the key is to be big, strong, and healthy, and make your own decisions. Not particularly about good and evil, which I'm just not so sure where that fits in, but about being aware of life is open and fullness and things like that. Solves all the problems of rules.
Well, John, you were talking about humility not 5 minutes ago. Where does that fit in?
Let me cite another passage. He says, you say it is the good cause that justifies war. I say it is the good war that justifies any cause.
Yeah.
Yes, very
Because he's
apropos.
saying, I'm not going to be bound by external rules.
Right.
I'm being bound by what I'm doing.
But you're not going to fear war either, are you?
No, he says that. He goes on to say, war and courage have accomplished more great things than love of neighbor. Not your pity, but your courage has so far saved the unfortunate. It comes from within him, rather than some external standard which he has to obey. And that's why he says God is dead, because that standard is no longer there.
Well, he values the individual strength over everything.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And he
yes.
has no care for individual suffering. He mentions that he realizes if the Oberman ever materialized, that it would cause tremendous upheaval in the world. There'd be wars like has never been seen before, and he takes the approach that would be a good thing, because to him, what we consider Christian ethics is total nonsense. It's the weakness of the human being, not his strength. And so he's a very strange person, thinking that way. But it's one of the things, like Richard was saying, is Nietzsche really a philosopher? It's one of the problems that these poet philosophers, I think of them as. Nietzsche is one, Sartre is another, Emerson and Thoreau, these people who they don't go A, B, C. They don't follow their thoughts in such a way that they're easy to interpret. And so somebody like Nietzsche can never really be interpreted in a a really ABC understandable way.
But most
Every writer
philosophers
that
can't.
writes about Nietzsche
Oh, yes, they
has a different opinion about him.
Yes, they do.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, that's how philosophers are all. That's what they're all about. I mean, philosophy is to raise questions and not to have answers.
Oh, I don't
So
think
there are
so.
many interpretations of him, and I'm sure everybody. That's what he really wants. He wants people to take it upon themselves to be and interpret from him, and let that be their lesson. I mean, based on this book, let's say.
Yeah, but philosophers like Kant and Aristotle and Plato, those people, they can be understood.
To some extent, and I think
But
he can
the
too.
poets can't be understood because they're not coherent. They're here, they're there, they're everywhere, and Nietzsche's a poet.
Well, let's say that that's the case. Let's say that Nietzsche wants us to do something different with his work than, just for the sake of argument, than Kant wanted us to do. What do y'all think that Nietzsche wants from us as readers? What do you think he wants to happen to me when I read Thus Spake Zarathustra? I mean, what is he going for?
I asked myself that question.
Before I even think for myself, do you think, I mean, because I think he wants me to be angry. I think he wants me to be shocked. I think he wants me to be disgusted. And I think he wants me to feel. I mean, in
And
short.
he calls it all in one lump nausea. He wants you to get nauseous before you go to the next place.
Well, there it is. I mean, it's prior to something else. In other words, he thinks that, I get the feeling he thinks I need to have these feelings before I can get beyond them.
I think that's true with most things in life. We don't change until we go through a catharsis, which allows us then to be another place.
Because he is an annoying human being.
Yes. There is this part, the stillest hour. It is the last part of 2, and before he goes into 3. Now, 3 is his exposition on the eternal recurrence. And when I read this, it sounded very much like the dark night of the soul kind of thing. I mean, here he has reached a point where this voiceless voice is talking to him about life, and the voiceless voice says, "You know the answer, don't you?" And he says, "Yes, but I'm not going to say so." and this voiceless voice goes over, and it ties in with what you had said earlier. And I'm sorry, your first name again? John. And you said this phrase, you said, "Thou art not yet humble enough for me. Humility hath the hardest skin." And I just thought, wow, I mean, is he saying that this philosophy of violence is really at its core the most humble? I mean, is this what you were getting at earlier?
You have to be strong in order to be humble. The person who's I'm humble, is usually the one who's after something, and he's weak. It's the person who truly becomes strong who can truly be humble, can let go.
Just to confirm what you say, I think he
Strong
says
words.
that those who give charity are doing it out of a power play of sorts. So if you're really a powerful person, there's no problem in your giving charity and being empathetic to others. It's the same. Yeah,
That's when you give charity, you're really giving it for yourself.
yeah, exactly.
Isn't one of the attractivenesses of Nietzsche the fact that he encourages you to face danger? Don't be afraid, do, act. The man who falls off the wire is congratulated because at least he faced danger. Don't take refuge in humility or doing good or things like that. You're a human being who faces, who does things, who is strong and anxious to act.
But this, I need to clarify. This stillest hour, it constantly comes to me. It's right before he is giving his strongest ideas. This strong man that you talk about, this rugged individual, this, this Ayn Rand kind of, fountainhead kind of, nothing will stand in my way, I get the feeling that he's saying there has to be this moment of deep reflection about what it is that you truly are before you boldly go in a matador. You know, there has to be this moment. And
Well, he says it in there. Then it spoke to me again without voice. You must yet become as a child and without shame. The pride of youth is still upon you. You have become young late. But whoever would become as a child must overcome his youth too.
yes.
He goes through that, and then he says, and laughter surrounded me. Alas, how this laughter tore my entrails and slit open my heart. And it spoke to me for the last time. O Zarathustra, your fruit is ripe, but you are not ripe for your fruit. Thus you must return to your solitude again, for you must yet become mellow. And that's basically what this stillest hour tells him. He's not finished yet. He must yet become mellow.
Yeah, my concern is that we, in his rejection of Christianity, that we don't go back to the gladiator, but we go forward to something even nobler. I mean, greatly nobler than Christianity. I get the feeling sometimes that we're seeing Nietzsche as the spokesman for the gladiator. And I said, I don't think this is what's on his mind. I really don't. I think he was profound. He was disturbed by something that we have to take that time. And to overcome requires that moment.
Is there some connection then between this risk-taking and humility?
Yes.
It's a hard. I can't but help but wonder if there isn't.
Is humility something very, very difficult?
Yes.
All right, there's a
True
long
humility.
discussion of the sort of the ethical, what do you call it, ethical food chain in that chapter on the self-overcoming. The weaker obey the strong, and the strong obey somebody's stronger, and somebody's stronger, and the strongest of all are the most obedient. You know, and my suggestion,
Sounds
I guess,
like the
the most
Tao Te
humble.
Ching. That's right. The
Well,
ruler is the most humble.
The outcome of humility, as I think he saw it in large, was the concept of the quality of man. And then you would have, if we're all humble, we would have democracy and utilitarianism, where one, the greatest good for the greatest number. And you would eliminate elitism, and therefore eliminate, in his terms, conquest of nature, of intellectual conquest, and you'd make everything moderate into a dull, repetitive life. And he saw that as evil, and I think he believed that England, in their ascendancy and in their Protestantism and democracy, in quotes, was a real problem for Europe. And he would, in his writings, create a rebirth, a rejuvenation of the fierceness of the North European blonde, blue-eyed conquerors, like the Northmen. Very dangerous guy. Needless to say.
Don't you think that we're trying to figure out what his ethics really are, but you think there's a real possibility he's just a cynical person, and he's just playing around with, I mean, he's obviously a true genius, and what does a true genius, who's a good, tremendous writer, one of the best writers of the German language ever, what does he do to occupy his time? I mean, he may very well just be playing games.
Do you think it could be both? He could be cynical and idealistic at the same time?
We possibly, sure, but the idea that he really has a real morality or a real plan for man's future.
But no matter
I think
who
he may
was.
not.
Let me ask you this.
No matter
Is it
who he
possible
was.
that it was a selfish gesture on his part and he really just wanted to overcome his own hang-ups about his illness?
Absolutely.
Could that be enough?
But no matter who he was human. I mean, he knew that. Like, maybe that was his moment of humility. I mean, he isn't God. He can't write history. He can't write the future. This is his idea, his philosophy.
Maybe.
But
Or
he will
maybe it's
never
a
know
hoax.
the final
Maybe the whole thing's a hoax.
answer.
I don't see any humility in Nietzsche at all.
Put in a blender two facts that, which both are perhaps incorrect. That man is an individual, and his best self-interests are to serve himself, no one else. And put in also the the fact that the Darwinian idea that there's survival of the fittest, and also include that God is dead. I suggest if you have any courage, you come out with some variation of "Thus spake Zoroaster," whatever. You know, I mean, what else can there be? He was courageous enough to jump that hurdle and say, yes, the normal readout of we human beings as animals, if we're totally self-interested, and if there's survival of the fittest, and those that are fittest are the ones that fit into the environment, then you come out with his whole morality.
Yeah,
now, I think we have to talk about those concepts that I just mentioned. Are they correct or not? But if you assume those, I think you have to come out with that.
Well, I think you have to look at humility as one concept. On the other side of it, it's well to be humble, but if you start taking refuge in just being humble all the time, it becomes an overwhelming aspect of your life, and that isn't really what life is all about. If you take Christian ethics and you take refuge in Christian ethics, why you become so involved with that doing right, what you think is right, and so on and so forth. Whereas if you are a healthy, open individual, you'll see, of course, you have to be humble sometimes, or be nice to people, or things like that. But the importance is that you are an individual, an openness, a matter of strength to others, and the key is not to take refuge in what we call ethical concepts, because that doesn't make life.
I don't think there's any characteristic that we may call a virtue or a positive point that isn't susceptible to his criticism. Nothing is sacred. Nothing is safe. So, not even humility.
You're safe in the sense that you're strong. You can decide what these things are if you determine to be an individual.
But it seems to me you're looking for goodness in Nietzsche.
Oh yes.
And you're thinking that this notion about not relying on Christian ethics as a crutch,
yeah,
can be overcome in a positive way. I think you're wanting Nietzsche to be positive here, but he's not. I don't think he is positive.
Certainly.
I think he is. He grew up in a very strict, domineering Christian family. He rebelled against Christianity, and he is a-religious, and he thinks religion is the weakness of man, and man at his best is immoral. And I think that's what he believes, and to try to read morality into that belief, I think we're fooling ourselves.
You remember the passage where he says, look, a strong man has the God, and his God is one who likes soap bubbles, butterflies. I would have the God who dances.
Right.
Well, see, his idea is that God has been projected as the afterworld. And he is saying that your God should be on earth, that people are of earth, and that their God should be of earth. His eternal reoccurrence is not similar to reincarnation, because he tells his disciples, you're the first one who will teach it. And it's this idea that the individual must overcome over and over and over again until the person gets it right, but not in the afterworld, right here. It's teachable. The eternal recurrence is teachable right here on earth.
What is to be
Well, who would
overcome?
follow him? He's a nasty man.
Oh, one thing is equality is to be overcome.
Well, all right. What does he mean? What does he mean by equality? I
Well, I
think
mean-
you're right, but I think again, what does he?
Well,
I think I'd be pretty clear on what he
in
means.
this-
But
Let's get back to the word overcome. Why do we have to see that literally the way we see it instead of the way I think he meant it? I think he means overcome to be examined, not master, but examine.
Yeah.
And I wonder
And if you
those-
look at it that way, I think you can take a totally different interpretation of a lot of the things that he says.
You have to be careful there because now you're bordering on the Socratic concept, and you know what he thought about Socrates.
I know that he admired Socrates a lot. I absolutely know that.
So,
I absolutely feel that.
you do.
I absolutely
Well,
do.
I don't think he had that much admiration for the man.
Well, he was a Greek scholar, and the little I know,
He
in the Greek
learned a lot from
philosophy was this concept of aletheia or alethera, maybe you know.
Truth, right?
The truth, but the
Undisclosedness.
truth
Right.
is within.
Right.
It's not external, and so part of the surpassing, or at least in my translation, but surpassing, not overcome, is to find that within one, in addition to surpassing others as a way of validating your own manhood and humanity.
Yeah.
But it doesn't stop there. It has to be manifest. It isn't just simply looking within and saying, I found it. It has to be manifest. It comes
behavior,
out.
yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
in a behavior. I mean,
Absolutely.
this fourth part, which to me is totally different than the other three. I found the fourth part almost burlesque. You know, he I know, really, I mean, it's just some of the incidences there, I was just laughing at, hysterically. I mean, and
What do you
yet
think
he
of the
said,
long ears?
and yet, right. It's just
No,
like-
I'm saying, I mean, but that has a lot of symbolism. I
Oh,
mean, I think that would be a neat discussion. What does he really mean by this ass festival and these long ears, and why was that such a prominent thing?
Well, in literature, that's the Menippean parodies. In other words, I will tell you something, but that's not really what I mean, but you really
Right.
know that's what I mean. It's that kind of playback on word. And in it, he comes up in part 4 with some of his great ideas. I mean, he kind of slides things in the middle of this humor. He just, God hath died, now do we desire? We desire the Superman to live, not just to know it, but to live. We are that. And it's, I like that idea.
His definition of life was to go beyond. In other words, we in this room, by his definition, are not even alive.
We're
You
existing.
have to be the Obermensch in order to be alive. You have to.
Be an examined person.
Well, you have to. Whatever he never really defines, I don't think exactly what that is, but you have to go beyond the human being to even be alive in his thoughts.
he's also
Right.
elsewhere
Aren't
he
there
talks.
degrees?
I don't. Well,
In other words,
I'm sure there is, but he said. I think he purposely is defining life in that way. I mean, that human beings with Christian ethics are not alive to him. So when he refers to that, that's what he means, I think.
how about a person who is humble and who is taking the risk of examining how things are? Does that person get any credit for taking that risk, for living in that danger zone, rather than spouting bromides and being humble so they have no decisions to make? I mean, in Nietzsche's work, does that person get some credit for having begun the process of dancing instead of walking?
Probably humble within himself, humble in the fact that he is intellectually honest to himself, humble, but not humble before other individuals. He gets no credit for that.
Right. And the whole purpose of the whole book is to go and examine, and then as a result of that, become your person. So certainly he not only gives credit, but that's what the whole book's about, is going off and examining.
Yeah, it's not freedom to decide, it's freedom
Right.
when you decide.
Exactly.
I mean, there's a little difference there, but It makes a difference in the way you live.
And at the end of this chapter, this one you're talking about, he decides he knows he's not quite ready yet. At this hour, this whatever, I forgot the chapter.
The stillest hour, number
Stillest hour.
44.
He is at the point where he has the laughter, but he knows he hasn't gone back and finished dealing with his youth and some of the problems yet.
Right.
Well, if
So
going,
he can't move on yet.
But recall that in an early chapter, he ridicules the academic professor who thinks good thoughts but doesn't act.
Well,
So clearly, performative behavior is essential. It's not enough to think the good thought or have the good ethic or have the great Kantian system. No, that's not it. Yeah.
well, the academic is the one who puts people to sleep. You know, that his purpose is to act on principles and things like that, which is a somnolent attitude. To
It's the received wisdom as opposed to the kind that comes from within.
It's the kind that challenges people.
The professor has is a challenging character?
Is the what?
Is the professor a challenging character to Nietzsche?
Quite the opposite.
That's exactly.
Yes. The challenge comes from recognizing you're in danger, and you respond to that.
John, were you going to read a passage?
There is a passage that backs this up. He gets around to the point of academics, and it sounds like today in some ways. Famous wise men, being the professors, famous wise men are asses, hitched in front of the powerful man's horses to lead them in the, quote, right way.
Yes.
That's what happens many times.
Well, I think that's hilarious.
he is no longer a scholar. So he was once a scholar.
Yes.
So he's no longer a scholar. But his path, this metamorphosis, is not clear to me. What has he done to separate him from these people?
Nietzsche or Zarathustra?
Zarathustra.
Well, he's had an epiphany of some sort, right?
What is it?
Well, I don't know what it is. He's just, all of a sudden, he's the Messiah, all of a sudden.
He comes off the mountain. What do you want? He could have stayed there
for 10 years.
Yeah,
That doesn't sound like
too.
all of a sudden.
Well, at the moment of Messiahdom, that's all of a sudden. That moment is, even if it's at the end of 10 years. I don't know.
Well, he did have to be ready to come down from the mountain.
Yeah, right.
What do you feel like is the catalyst for him to come down?
It's my personal opinion is that he finally dealt with he got rid of the nausea, and he finally dealt with the issue of pity, which for him was fear. And it was pity, and I think, again, it ties back to his own personal life.
You mean Nietzsche's?
I think it was getting over pity for himself in terms of his own illness and his own sickness and being able to move out from there. I mean, I think that's the whole purpose in writing this book, was to deal with how he was going to overcome his illness and be able to work, to be able to write. And I think at the end he even says that now that he is able to be in happiness and silence, what he really wants to do is work. And I think now he can do it because he's dealt with the big fears and he's dealt with his pity for himself. Now he's ready to go back to work.
What is the danger of people pitying themselves and others? I mean, what is Nietzsche afraid about for us? If we live our lives looking at other people and saying, "Oh, poor thing," or looking at ourselves and saying, "Oh, poor me." What's the really big danger there?
Yeah, doesn't he put it in a funny way that if you pity, say, the lame man or the blind man, aren't you? It says something in fact you're taking away his lameness or his blindness.
And what other crutch does he have? His blindness, his lameness,
well, does he? Maybe that's it. Does he think that the lame or the blind ought to be crutched that way?
Well, he thought that his own illness was the best thing ever happened to him in his philosophical development.
Right.
And so here's a man who suffered physically very greatly, apparently, and yet he felt like it was the best thing that ever happened to him.
I think
So why should he pity? Why should he pity other
Because
people?
it gave him the opportunity to examine and
Yeah.
then to come under.
Exactly.
Then to come over.
Yeah. No, coming over is examining. It's under is when he's able to teach what
And
he's
so,
learned.
yeah. And so why does he think it's a better starting point to have suffering than to be that person who just seems to have everything and everything is easy for that person? Why is it easier to be the one who starts from suffering?
I
And
don't
that
think you
seems
ever
clear.
get any place unless you've been
forced to
through a
think
lot,
that
as it were.
Pardon?
In this
You've
case,
been forced
suffering.
to think and examine your life in a way that maybe that person who has everything hasn't felt that compulsion to do that, maybe. Like, if they have everything, they don't have the reason to ask, why am I suffering? That somebody who is sick might have.
Yes, and Christianity would trivialize that, according to him, because your reward is in the next world, and you're not taking the suffering now. You're really saying, well, I'll really get my reward elsewhere. I'll suffer, but there's really a great reward
Tiny
for me.
Tim.
Yeah, that Tiny Tim, yeah, kind of mentality. That's good.
And isn't his reward laughter and courage?
Pride and wisdom.
Well, that's what gets him where he gets.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's the laughter and courage that are rewards. But the things that got him through were his two animals, his
Eagle.
one representing pride, the eagle, and the other representing wisdom, which was the serpent. So they were with him in silence and courage, in a sense. They were with him through this whole process. And then at the end, when he was able to enjoy who he'd become, it was as a result of the happiness and silence that they basically gave through to him, which ultimately gave him the ability to be able to have laughter and courage.
I like when he comes off the mountain, he raises a question to the sun. And I completely missed this until someone asked the question in this room, and I said, I got to go back. And it says, thou great star, what would be thy happiness if thou hadst not those for whom thou shinest?
Exactly.
In other words, you'd be the same. Whether or not any humans were down here, you would be as brilliant and as bright and as magnificent as you are, whether anyone was here or not.
Yeah.
And I said, wow, that's a very powerful urge to go through life with that feeling of, I am who I am. I am magnificent. Period. The end.
Yeah.
No matter what influence, I'm still going to be this magnificence.
But,
I didn't take it that way.
but would the sun be magnificent if they didn't have people to explain how it is magnificent?
No, that's a good point. Good point.
Well, it rather reminded me of the question about the tree falling in the forest. From a audiologist's point of view, there's no sound unless there's an ear to hear the
Yeah, remember, he
sound and,
is a poet. I mean, he is speaking as a poet in this respect. I mean, I don't think he's really addressing the sun either. I think he's
Right.
really referring to himself.
Right.
But
no, I mean, because I think this it struck me as a central point that the sun's magnificence is only magnificent if there is someone to appreciate it. And furthermore, the sun's real magnificence is its going under, as it's sinking down and spreading out over the sea. And as every commentator reminds you, the word for going under that comes over and over again is the same word in German for perishing. And, somehow that, on the one hand, I want to think of the guy who got out of Plato's cave and goes back, drag the others out. On the other hand, so there's a suggestion that in your self-overcoming, you're perishing too.
well, you have to. You would have to perish before you you overcame and established yourself. You would have to. The old self has got to die. I mean, period. I mean, it can't be lingering in it. So it's.
Well,
I mean,
It's interesting. I thought,
and well, even maybe even the whole self, but
I thought that passage there was absolutely crucial and suggests how incorrect Nietzsche really is. Because I think he mistakes the natural self of man to be an individual, a self-contained corpus, and I think that's obviously incorrect. I think we're all born to families, and of course, in primitive life, there was kin, and the altruism between kin was absolutely natural. There were hunting groups that shared. There was no way in the development of man to survive as an individual. In fact, we're built to be gregarious. Now here's a man who never married, never fondled children, lived by himself. He doesn't understand the satisfaction, joys, delight of others. And from just a mechanistic point of view, a biological point of view, our parents or our children have half the genes that we do. And if the purpose of life is replication of genes, then if two survive, that's equivalent to you. So clearly it's in our genes to be, it's a bad word, altruistic, or have feeling
No, but it is.
For others. And he bases his whole concept of everything on individual man. And that's why he's in every fundamental elementary way absolutely incorrect. And I think that's the flaw in the whole
Can't you
argument.
use his own death as his own breakdown as a perfect example that the man does have feelings? He saw somebody beating a horse, and it totally took him under. I don't want to use the word under. Totally did him in because he couldn't stand to see the horse suffer.
Well, doesn't that vitiate 300 pages before that? You know.
Well, I'm saying I think it's making a judgment about somebody who wasn't into being judged. He didn't talk about his feelings. That was the whole thing of it. He wanted you to talk about yours. But if you look at what he had the nervous breakdown over and what really took him under, it was because it pained him and broke him up seeing somebody beating a horse, and he went over and put his arms around the horse. And I mean, that's not a man without feeling.
The whole point here
it's irrelevant.
It's not irrelevant.
The whole point of this Obermann is to overcome what you just said.
Yes.
Nietzsche recognized the fact that man had evolved. He knew Darwin. He recognized the social evolution, the biological evolution, and he saw that as a weakness. And the whole point of the Obermann is to overcome that.
You know, he hated the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. That was like an awful concept. I mean, it was just terrible. And yeah, and you went back to this altruism. I wanted to ask you earlier, John, you're saying that there is no such thing as an altruistic act. Is in essence, because you were going in that direction, and
I think
would that be true?
If you're strong enough, if you're strong enough to overcome your own self-interest.
But can you give charity knowing that you're doing good for yourself, but also doing good for somebody else? Does that invalidate your charity? I mean,
well, I think Nietzsche's problem is that people can't tell the difference. When people give to charity, they're really doing it to benefit themselves, according to Nietzsche, and without considering whether it's going to benefit the recipient.
See, there's a clarity that, I'll be very honest with you, I hope I don't put me in this classification with him, but I enjoy that clarity, the idea of, no, there isn't an altruistic act. Everything you do is selfish. Why don't you just admit it and live with it? I mean, every act that you do. I mean, even the nuns who go to the leper colonies. Yes, we understand. But what you're getting is little green cards to go to heaven. I mean, that's what you want.
but don't you think that some acts, while they can still be complete, they can come from a selfish perspective, the result can be more or less selfless? I mean, not every single act.
Well, now you're judging by consequent rather than motive.
Right.
Yeah.
I am.
Well,
This is the whole thing he's saying. Don't be judgmental to begin with, so it doesn't matter.
I think in this case he does want to make a judgment here, because he does think that there are some that there's a kind of charity that does harm both the giver and the recipient.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, even if it's a kind of charity that's done for the wrong reasons, it's going to have the wrong consequences. Even if the consequences appear to be beneficial. they can, like, giving your 4 bits to the homeless man on the corner. All right, if that's, preventing that homeless man from doing something to amend his life in a productive way in the long run, that's ultimately harmful. That's kind of a rough example.
Yeah, well, what about the tough love movement that some people might know a little bit about? I don't know if anyone's had personal experience with it, but the tough love movement says that the nicest thing you can do for any other human individual, that would include your own children, is to treat them like a responsible person, even if they're not acting like a responsible person. In other words, to throw them away from yourself.
What would you say to a mother who's suckling her child? Is she being selfish there? Or is she extending her selfness to someone else? I mean, it seems to me this individualism that he proposes just breaks down right away in families, in groups that have to survive with consequences. They can only live together. Certainly farmers, or when agriculture came, you needed protective groups. You needed, and he says nothing about that. He believes that Darwin's ideas extend only to the individual and not to social groups. And of course, that just ain't true.
Well, I thought he wasn't even dealing with the groups. He was just dealing with the individual thing, so that wasn't an issue.
Right, I agree.
Exactly. That's where he's mistaken, you see, because...
Well, that's if you decide that that's the way it should be, but he's deciding it should be differently.
Or that he's just not going to discuss that now. He's just talking about this subject, not another subject.
No, but I'm trying to talk about truth and reality. What is real? Shall we live according to our primitive will as individuals? Is that a correct way of living? Does that make sense? Or does it not make sense because of the way human beings inherently are? Because his arguments are that human beings inherently are willful, and we might as well just forget about the taboos of repressing all these unconscious motives of wanting to kill and eat and conquest, and just expose them, you see. And that's based on the idea that we are just individuals. But if that's not the case, if the currency of human beings are groupings, then clearly I don't want to eat the people I'm depending on to hunt with me, you see.
Was it conceivable?
If you're a painter, you have to figure out what your expression is going to be about before you can create it. And I thought he was just in that creating who you are and expressing it, period.
Right.
I think that
and that's where he's mistaken.
Well, unfortunately, he didn't talk about communities and families because he really didn't have a lot of personal experience at that. Well, he talked about what he knew.
Exactly. But
that's not necessarily wrong. That's just what he could do.
Well, don't you think that it's wrong that we human beings are isolated individuals?
No, I think that's judgmental. I think some people, that's all that's going to happen to them. And I think you can go to other philosophers or poets and learn something else. But this is what you can learn from him, if you choose to.
If you assume that we're individuals.
If you choose to, that's right. And that's all he's saying. I'm not going to try to make all people's needs met through my philosophy. I'm not dealing with things that I can relate to. And suffering was a big one he could relate to.
Right. Isn't he saying, look, let's accept all this of life, all this, wars, greed, things like that. That's part of life. You must accept that. But the worst thing is to give in to certain things like greed or aspects of life that you know are surrounding you. But the healthy attitude is to rise above these things, to recognize them, to treat them even with laughter, as he says, and to make a full, strong life, not surrounded by rules against this or not thinking this or rules here or ironic humility, where you do something for an ulterior purpose or something like that. But there's an aspect of life that everyone must feel. I mean, everyone here must feel that you know, you can rise above these things and lead a full, happy, strong life without restrictions and things like that, without worrying about Christian morals or anything else. You don't live by these. Yeah.
In that context, how do you explain his statement? And he made the statement several times that if someone has cursed you, don't get mad. Do some cursing yourself.
Well, what's the difficulty? If someone curses me, I shouldn't be angry?
No, but you should not be angry. You should curse that person.
Well, isn't that a natural reaction? Is there anything wrong with you know, if somebody whacks me in the nose and I whack them in the mouth? I mean, after all, this is life. Is it your position that if someone whacks me over the head with a stick, I should say thank you, or that I should say I'll turn my back and let you whack the back too? You know, it doesn't seem to me that's a very practical thing.
What about initiating hitting someone over the head with a stick?
Who, me?
Yes, you.
Well, you know, I would have to have a purpose there.
Well, you just will it. You want
well,
it.
I'm
You
not,
have that urge.
But that isn't reality, is it? You know, if I'm, I don't go around
That's
whacking.
the reality of the Superman. His
no.
his will is expressed.
But it's not whim, it's will.
Of course.
Okay, let's make sure we don't get the two confused.
Look, if you're saying I have the capability of doing that, yes, I will agree with you. But if you say in reality I would do such things, why, I think that's a little removed from reality, and doesn't work here.
Well, I don't see it from reality. I see Nietzsche saying that you, as an individual, to survive, if you need to, whack the person over the head with a stick. And my next question would be, if you're hungry, are you going to whack your mother over the head with a stick? You say, I think that's suggesting that we're each individuals, your mother and you, and I think that's a false notion, you say.
Well, does being in a group mean you're any less of an individual? Somehow I think this I wonder about this distinction between individual and group.
Well, I think so. From what I know is that before, say, 2,500 years ago or so, all human beings survived in terms of groups, and only with the beginning of the Greek city-states did this whole concept of individualism start being propounded as really as a way to give responsibility to individuals who are now separated from their tribe or group. So it's a very artificial situation that we really aren't individuals. We're in groups, and furthermore, in our heads, we're extended in time and place. We don't just, in fact, we never quite live in the present. So I think if you factor in all those ideas, I think that you have to say that Nietzsche just was incorrect.
Could I ask you to define, since this is a philosophy club, what is the difference, in your opinion, between an individual and a personality? Because individual to me sounds like it's just a biological thing.
Yeah, an individual would be, sure, a separate reproducing source. A personality, I don't know how that's relevant, but to me it would be the mind, which lives not in the present, but I can live. Well, I'm constantly living in the future, where I'm going to be. I live in the past, in time. You know, so I'm not just in this corpus box of my individual.
Exactly. So, I mean, perhaps Nietzsche is working on this concept that the overcoming is the overcoming of the individual to become personality.
And individualism is just a point of view.
Well,
if you consider yourself an individual, then you are an individual. If you consider yourself just an appendage of a group, then that's what you are. And
Could you be both?
no, I don't think so. I mean, you can't be an appendage. You can be a member of a group and still be an individual.
People
but you
act
can't be
differently.
you can't be a finger on the same hand
No.
and be an individual.
But people also act differently within as a group than they do some. I mean, like sociologically now, there are studies that
Well,
didn't
they
exist
do,
when
but
Nietzsche did, but
Nietzsche would say that
herd
that's
mentality.
an evil, because the highest aspiration of a human being is his individuality, not his function as a group. And I don't think he, as far as I know, he never extrapolated this philosophy into a political philosophy. He didn't try to create some utopian notion about what his society would be like. He, as you were saying, this is focusing in on human nature and what he thought a human being should be, what a human being's highest aspirations were, and forgetting about the social and political aspects of it.
Right.
And obviously, I mean, I think we probably all agree that the political aspects of this whole notion are just incomprehensible. It just isn't something that won't work in a society where there's more than 3 people.
Well, let me ask something.
tried.
I have heard it said that Friedrich Nietzsche is a psychologist and one of the first.
Yes.
Are we saying that Nietzsche's book is really a psychology book?
Yes.
And that he does not deal with these implications? And that other people have taken his work and have interpreted it for their own purposes when they want to think about the state, when they want to think about ethics. But for Nietzsche, he's talking about the struggle of being one human person. Is it possible he's a psychologist?
Well, he's giving Zorba meaning. He's giving, I mean, Zorba the Greek is this personality. It's incredible. It's very free. It doesn't talk of equality. It talks of expression, manifesting. It's a true personality. It isn't simply, I follow the group. And this is what the herd mentality is what you're trying to get rid of. You're trying to get the master mentality.
And my thought is that's the beauty of the whole thing. He is Nietzsche, just like the word psychologist, the word philosopher, the word writer, the word teacher. He is all of those things and yet none of those things, and that's the beauty of it. He refuses to be put in a box.
He
Absolutely refuses.
doesn't ever use the word state or group. He uses the word herd.
He does use state.
Pejorative aspect.
Yes, he does, because he
Herd
calls
are
it the
people who
monster.
follow.
Yes.
Along those lines, Freud said that Nietzsche was the most, he knew himself more than anyone who's ever lived, and likely ever will live. So Freud had a very high opinion of Nietzsche.
We have to consider
We have to consider
Yeah.
Freud, that's right. But still in all, when you talk about psychology.
Well, does this perhaps suggest another view of philosophy here? If you're going to say, I mean, at least it almost sounds like you're suggesting that for Nietzsche, philosophy originates in psychology instead of, say, metaphysics.
I wonder.
And I don't know, I could point to passages here where he talks about, might this have something to do with his celebration of the body, the earthly, and
the Dionysian.
What difference does it make?
Well, that's a very good question. What difference does it make what your starting point is? And I wonder if Nietzsche thinks that the starting point has to be the confusion of human beings in the face of impermanence, whether it's a group of human beings or whether it's an individual human being, but that sort of confusion kind of does start here.
I think it makes a difference.
I think it does make a great difference. I think he inherited Schopenhauer's concept, which I think I'm quoting, the world is my idea, meaning that the world is my perception. It doesn't exist as is, it exists in my head. So if I can pull out my real unconscious motives, which he does, and articulate them, well, then you have a clear page of where to go from here. I mean, that's the greatness.
You think that's What do you think? Do you like that idea?
Do I like? It doesn't really matter if I like it. I think it's one of the great jumps in the history of intellect.
Aside from all that,
mankind.
do you associate?
Aside from all that,
do you associate your life with that? Do you find anything interesting in it?
In what?
Schopenhauer's use of the idealistic mind for the world. Is that of any use practically?
I think it's absolutely true. I think it can be shown that all, I don't want to go through a whole, I could with you after, but that really all what you think out here is reality is just a perception of a mind that he evolved in a late Pleistocene age.
Yes, do you think that?
Of course I think that. I wouldn't be telling you if I didn't.
Oh, all right.
Are you calling me a liar?
That's the point. How can you bump into trees then? If your world is only in your mind, how do you...
forces holding the molecules together. I don't want to get into that, but I could explain that to you, and you would perhaps understand. In fact, I just gave a lecture on that just a week
But
ago.
Nietzsche was not an idealist. He had contempt for idealism.
Yes, certainly.
Well, define your terms. What do you mean
Well,
by idealism?
idealism meaning a world is totally, or a universe is totally mental, totally in the imagination. Nietzsche didn't believe that.
But I don't think that's what he meant by idealism. He meant saying that this world is created by our mind. That is a form of idealism.
Well, this world is the
because it's
universe.
my perception.
This world is the universe.
But this chair exists, but it's also my perception of this chair, which makes it ideal.
But that's not what idealism means, though. The idealism, from a philosophical point of view, means that chair does not exist except in your mind.
If it is perceived, it is real.
Yeah, if it's perceived, it's real, but it doesn't exist outside of your own perception.
And
That would be
correct.
idealism, classic idealism.
Undoubtedly correct.
Well, you think so. I don't think so.
Makes how we talk about things very difficult to explain, if that's correct. I mean, you're talking about, you asked about the tree that you bumped into. Well, it's, of course, my idea of a tree that I bumped into, which can't be the same tree that anyone else bumped into.
But right.
Well,
Exactly.
The tree
But it
that I'm
can still
talking
be
about,
enough of a tree to talk about it as a tree.
Not if it's just my idea of a tree.
But if your idea of a tree is so incrementally different than my idea of a tree, we can still talk about a tree.
No, not unless there's a tree out there that
But I'm saying,
correlates
if
those
we bumped
ideas
into
to
the
one
same
another.
tree, and you're saying, like, my perception of a tree can be different from yours, but
Right.
it can be so close, but it's just that much different, that we are able to talk about that tree. Do you see? Because we come from a culture where that sees this
Well,
tree and
first of
defines
all,
this tree,
I
and
have-
that's where it goes
I mean,
into our
how
mind.
we decide how close our ideas are.
Because we know because we can converse about this tree.
Oh, but I think that has to do both with similarities of idea and the fact that there's a tree out there we're talking about.
And also linguistics.
But
And
there
the
isn't
people
a
who write
tree.
poems about
And as we read in Wittgenstein a few sessions ago, it's just a
This is
language.
perfect Nietzsche because he was a linguistic
It's just
master.
a
So
language.
this is an example of the
Excuse
way
me,
his whole head works.
Excuse me, it's just a language game. The only function of language is performative. You can get things done with it, but it means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. And I know that's so difficult for you to
No, it's not
to
just
see.
difficult, it's nonsense. I mean,
It is.
what you're saying can't mean anything if that's true.
Right.
You can't say look out for the falling tree, huh?
Yeah.
Well, there are no, as far as I know, there are no serious idealists left in the philosophical world. Idealism is a notion that came and went.
Royce was.
Well, everybody, on the other hand, people argue that Nietzsche is the sort of the summa of idealism, and again, for this very, particularly in his regard to his ethics, this idealism applied to morality.
Oh yeah, but that's a different type of ideal. That's a mental idealism as opposed to a physical idealism. I mean,
Okay, I'm wondering if
we're
there's a,
getting a little
I keep
field
wondering if
here.
there's an, I mean, I agree with you,
Yeah,
but
we're
I
gonna
keep
feel
wondering if there's if Nietzsche doesn't bridge the two somehow, or what's the connection between the two?
I don't think so. I think he was a realist from a... I mean, the mere fact of his contempt for religion and things spiritual, he was a realist. So the idea that he would also be an idealist,
You don't think an
especially when he
Ubermensch is an
says
ideal?
he's not an idealist, I think is unlikely.
You don't think an Übermensch is an ideal?
Huh?
And you don't think the
Right.
idea of the Übermensch is an ideal? Something.
It's an idea. It's not an ideal.
Right.
It's a different word.
No, it's a
in philosophy.
Platonic ideal because in the Übermensch is merely potential. The Übermensch
Can you
never...
define what you mean by Übermensch?
No.
Superman.
I think it would be important because I
That's
think
exactly
that's one
what
of the
I'm
problems.
saying. The Übermensch is an ideal. It's something transcendent. It cannot be reached. It has potential. It does not exist objectively.
And I would suggest that there's another way to look at the Übermensch as just plain anybody who really examines themselves. That's really all I think he's saying with Übermensch.
I
The
can't
person
quote,
who
but
truly
that's
examines
the case.
oneself.
Do we have anything in the book? Can anybody think of anything in the book that might contribute to what his
I think it's the
idea
whole,
of
every time he refers to Uber, it's an examination. Every time he refers to under, it's teaching.
Well, he
all
talks
throughout
about
the
man as we know him as a bridge, as a tightrope between
Right.
the beast and the overman or Übermensch.
But he talks about, excuse me. His definition changes sometimes because at one point he says under, and then you have a semicolon, and he has dying.
Had what?
Dying.
You have to die to it. You have to die.
Well, if it's a semicolon, it's another thought. If it's a colon, it's not. But a semicolon, that's another thought.
Well, that's what the English teachers say, but that's...
Well, he certainly was
Well,
a
in the
master.
context of the statement, it's a
Yeah, what page are you
rewording.
on to?
I can't find it right now.
Could it be that the Superman, in some real sense, is a secular Christ?
That's where we started, isn't it?
Yeah,
As I
going back
recall.
to
I still say an Uberman is the person who examines himself.
But by whose
With
definition?
total intellectual honesty.
Absolutely.
But
Total
how do you
intellectual honesty.
define
Which
that
is something
total
most of us
intellectual honesty?
probably will
How do
never
you define it?
Yeah, it's an
Well,
ideal. I
Intellectual,
mean-
intellectual honesty is the ability not to fool yourself.
But who will know if you? I mean, I'm just like
Well,
you can keep
it's
asking
hard.
questions.
You
can't
have
ever
to
answer
keep
that
examining yourself constantly in order to be intellectually honest.
question. Right.
But,
so I think
that's
it's an
part of it,
ideal.
actually.
It's
The-
Yeah,
idealistic.
there's no way. There's no standard, is what you said. There's no absolute. The's no ultimate
checklist
reference for any of that.
saying
You
this
said.
is what
Well,
it
it
is.
can
That's
only
why
be
it's not
individual.
ideal.
It can only be individual. Intellectual honesty. No one. What I'm
It's a
saying to you
goal
right
to-
now,
to-
you don't know whether I'm being honest or not. Only I know if I'm not only being honest with relating what I think, but also what I think I have arrived at in an honest way, an intellectually honest way.
You're
You
quite
can never
unaware
know.
of your
Only I can know that.
repressions, suppressions, and all of that, you know?
But
That's
without-
what Nietzsche is getting at. He's trying to reveal his unconscious.
Or back to some things we said before. When you get that terror, when you get that danger feeling, when you get that fight or flight response, you might be close to the truth. You might know.
And
Doesn't mean Alfred knows
Might
that you're
know
having
what?
that feeling in the pit of your stomach, that you're telling yourself something true that you really wish weren't true about yourself.
And the beauty
Oh,
and the absolute brilliance of the way Nietzsche writes is that he never tells you about himself. The whole book is about the process. It's the process of getting there and then going from there. But he does not contradict because you never find out who he is in terms of what he examines and where he gets to in terms of his process.
You wouldn't agree that he's saying
That's the
every one
beauty.
of us is a Superman.
No, I'm saying absolutely not every one of us is, but he's saying everybody's capable of being an Ubermensch. It's just a matter of whether you have the guts and the courage to go there.
Did you find a passage that you had wanted to read?
198, on page 198.
That's in this this edition, Modern Library.
Now I wait for my own redemption, that I may go to them for the last time. For I want to go to men once more. Under their eyes, I want to go under. Dying, I want to give them my richest gift.
Dying, comma, is not the same as going under. It's a total another thing. By going under, he's saying, I want to be able to go and teach.
And then die.
Dying, comma, in other words, he's still in the Übermensch phase. He's still examining. Dying at this point is the same as examining. I want to give them examining. Dying at this point is the same as examining. I want to give them my richest gift.
Examining, you said, was over. The over.
Right.
Going over.
There's a semicolon there. He's not saying under and dying are the same word. He's saying, I want to go under, semicolon. In dying, in other words, just say dying, I want to give them my richest gift.
Okay, so let's substitute. Let's go for under, let's say, I want to go teaching.
I want to go, I want to be able to teach. By examining, I want to give them my richest gift. I want to be able to give back, to teach. His richest gift will be the accomplishment of having gone under.
Went with over, and under went with teaching. So if you substitute teaching here, I want to go under, and under is equated with teaching.
Right.
And he said, I want to teach, and then he wants to die.
Right. He wants to give them his richest gift. He wants to be able to do that, to go down and give and tell them what he's learned through his examination.
Why does he call it his redemption? And this is the only passage where I can, well, at least the most obvious passage I can think of in which Overman and redemption, which Overman and secular Christ perhaps seem to be associated here. And
redemption is like being born again. It's like, in other words, by getting through the examination process and becoming, in this case, he refers to creating the child to again be redeemed, born again, so that he can go and teach, so that he can be a child.
I like the sentence that begins the next paragraph. He says, like the sun, Zarathustra too wants to go under. Now he sits here and waits, surrounded by broken old tablets and new tablets half covered with writing. The message being, I've done the annihilating, I've done that hard work, and I'm in the process of creation. It's not that he's got the old tablets are broken and the new tablets are done. Here, everyone, here's the truth. I went through the process, and now you don't have to, because here's the truth. The new tablets are only half covered with writing.
And the broken tablets is the ability for the Superman to say, in his deepest, deepest commitment, there is no God. It has ceased to exist. It is dead, finished. Now let's get on with the business of evolving. You know, this concept God has really held us back. That's done with. Now
See,
we
I
go
have
forward.
trouble with saying that it's held us back.
Well,
Because,
he even
I
says that.
I want to read it more like the psychologist version that Lisa talked about, which is, the book even opens up, you've got the sun, which Socrates used as an analogy for the good. And now it's the sun that rises up to the cave, and it's the people on the earth that give the sun its meaning, although he did, in this passage we just looked at, learn from the sun. But it seems to me that God's death, the literary play he does with the sun at the beginning of the work, all point to this idea that these transcendental notions of morality, ethics, the good, they're gone.
Yes.
They're not there. And what perhaps we are going to be faced with in an eternally recurring way is the fact that they're gone, but we still have to make evaluative judgments. And perhaps the Übermensch has to recognize, in the face of no external measure, that he's got to make these choices, or she has to make, well, for Nietzsche, he's got to make these choices. And I don't admit my time to being humble also. I'm not doing the right thing, but I'm recognizing that I have to make these choices, and I can't turn anywhere else for them. I do them. But the objection was the idea that we can get on. I mean, other than just recognizing that each choice we make is ours.
Yes.
I'm not sure that it would, not that he has to be consistent, but that it would be consistent for there to be a kind of progress after realizing this, in the sense that there may have been a progress for Plato or for Jesus or Christianity in progressing towards some sort of ultimate being.
That was a useful fiction in its day, but it's finished now.
Right.
Right. That's the kind of thing.
Well, or maybe just wrong all along. Not,
Well, I
not
mean,
that it was useful ever. It's just an illusion that we...
Could we say for Nietzsche that people are works in progress, but that we won't be finished? Or does that just make no sense at all? In other words, that you're constantly a work in progress, not toward any particular goal of being finished and perfect in that sense of, you know, completely yourself. Can you be a work in progress, but by definition never be done?
There's
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Again, I interpret that as being the same but not the same, over and over and over again.
And you're going to
And
break the
progressing.
tablets and start writing on some new ones?
Well, man is, yeah.
People are.
And of course, every individual has to do it himself. That's another thing, right? It's not a cultural thing. It's an individual thing.
That's Picasso's.
Huh?
That was Picasso's idea. Finish the art and you destroy the artist.
Oh, it wasn't.
Well, does that mean that everyone's a Superman, decide for themselves these things?
I think you have to recognize that that's what you're doing.
Yes.
And I think it's... I mean, I would say it's clear that's not everyone.
Well, then how do you make the distinction?
Are you allowed to say that you're an Ubermensch?
On what grounds?
That's a good question. Did everybody hear Jesse's question?
Are you allowed to say that you're an Ubermensch?
Sure.
Woman.
Because a true...
Actually, mensch is good. Mensch is not male or female.
Exactly.
Male and female.
Sure, because an Obermensch would be brave enough to admit that he was an Obermensch. So you're allowed to.
Or would the fact that you think you're an Ubermensch mean that you're not one?
Well, doesn't it mean this, that you
might.
begin to see, you know, what it means to be an Ubermensch. And isn't that open to everyone?
No.
I would think
No.
the
No.
task of
Are we allowed to
becoming
talk
one should
about
be
it
open to
in
everyone.
I hope somebody says no, because
Well,
I,
he
you know,
Am I allowed to
mentioned-
disbelieve you?
Well, he has no use for the bourgeois, and by that he means the business
the
people.
herd, yes.
Well, no, I think he has the herd and the rabble in a different category. They're, of course, clearly not. But the people who have been successful and made a lot of money in busyness, and in my book it's B-U-S-Y, and just keeping busy, certainly not. And he mentions that there would have to be blood there, which I take to be a genetic factor. So I think he's suggesting that the old European aristocracy has a possibility of being the Ubermensch if they meet some other criteria, which I tell you is rather dangerous kind of teaching. Thinking about the history of European aristocracy and the kinds of warfare and chaos that has been created as a direct result of their rule constantly. It reminds me that Wags have said, you know, the old Greeks had this idea of being real men by surpassing other men. And there are very few of those Greeks left, you know. They killed each other off. And I think perhaps Nietzsche's philosophy, if it were taken intact as a way to perform, would of course result in destruction. And I think, and I don't know how much Hitler read of Nietzsche and was following those precepts, but I think that probably is a good example, or is probably the best example that you could probably give of acting it at will. Absolutely.
I think that's dangerous, though, is to read Hitler
Yeah,
into Nietzsche.
absolutely.
Well,
That's
there's
not fair to him.
I agree.
There's a caveat. He says, never will something that is beyond your power. So you've got to be very honest about your capacity to manifest that will. It isn't just simply whim, gee, I want this, or I'm going to go over there and beat people up. It's, no, I will will this because I know that I can do it, and it will be manifested. I mean, when you were saying earlier about Schopenhauer, I mean, the will is world. I mean, everything in this room is the will of somebody. It's just a frozen aspect of their will, from table design to books. And
It's the will of a lot of different kinds of
oh yes,
people.
but
It's
they're
not
not in one person. No, it's some individual who's saying, "I will this."
Are the electrons running around that table conforming to your will? I mean, be serious.
I am very serious. The world is will. They're they're in that table, but the shape of
No,
it.
the
If I
table-
were designing
The
that,
table is your perception of the light beams coming from the surface of that thing.
that's the
That's all it
receiver.
is.
But the person who conceived of that table originally had a concept of table, and he exerted that will somewhere to make sure that table became manifest. You know, maybe it was somebody forgotten, but nevertheless, somebody's will was exerted there.
Well, let me raise another consideration. Elsewhere, Nietzsche says that living is willing, or that just to be alive is to will.
But his definition of living was different than most definitions. He didn't consider a normal or a present day, let's say, man as being alive.
Yeah,
Well,
to suggest...
So the will, one who's able to exercise his will and be a true individual and exercise his will to where he's the master of himself, that person's alive.
Right.
But one who isn't is not alive.
Could we say for Nietzsche that people are works in progress, but that we won't be finished? Or does that just make no sense at all? In other words, that you're constantly a work in progress, not toward any particular goal of being finished and perfect in that sense of completely yourself. Can you be a work in progress, but by definition never be done? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Again, like I interpret that as being the same but not the same, over and over and over again.
And you're going to
And
break the
progressing.
tablets and
Yeah.
start writing on some new ones?
Well, man is, yeah.
People are.
And of course, every individual has to do it himself. That's another thing, right? It's not a cultural thing. It's an individual thing.
That's Picasso's.
Huh?
That was Picasso's idea. Finish the art and you destroy the artist.
Oh, was it?
Well, does that mean that everyone's a Superman, decide for themselves?
I think you have to recognize that that's what you're doing.
Yes.
And I think it's, I would say it's clear that's not everyone.
Well, then how do you make the distinction?
Are you allowed to say that you're an
On what
Ubermensch?
grounds?
That's a good question. Did everybody hear Jesse's question?
Are you allowed to say that you're an Ubermensch?
Sure.
Woman,
Because
whatever the term
a
is.
true...
Actually, mensch is good.
Yeah.
Mensch is not male or female.
Exactly.
Sure, because an Obermensch would be brave enough to admit that he was an Obermensch. So you're allowed to.
Or would the fact that you think you're an Ubermensch mean that you're not one?
Well, doesn't it mean this, that you
might.
begin to see, what it means to be an Ubermensch, and isn't that open to everyone?
No.
I would think
No.
the task of
Are we allowed to
becoming
talk
one should
about
be
it
open
in
to everyone.
I hope somebody says no, because
Am I allowed to believe or disbelieve you?
Well, he has no use for the bourgeois, and by that he means the business people.
The herd, yes.
Well, no, I think he has the herd and the rabble in a different category. They're, of course, clearly not. But the people who have been successful and made a lot of money in busyness, and in my book it's B-U-S-Y, and just keeping busy, certainly not. And he mentions that there would have to be blood there, which I take to be a genetic factor. So I think he's suggesting that the old European aristocracy has a possibility of being the Ubermensch if they meet some other criteria, which I tell you is rather dangerous kind of teaching. Thinking about the history of European aristocracy and the kinds of warfare and chaos that has been created as a direct result of their rule constantly. It reminds me that wags have said, you know, the old Greeks had this idea of being real men by surpassing other men. And there are very few of those Greeks left, you know. They killed each other off. And I think perhaps Nietzsche's philosophy, if it were taken intact as a way to perform, would of course result in destruction. And I think, and I don't know how much Hitler read of Nietzsche and was following those precepts, but I think that probably is a good example, or is probably the best example that you could probably give of acting it at will. Absolutely.
I think that that's dangerous, though, is to read Hitler into Nietzsche.
Absolutely.
Well,
that's not fair to him.
I agree.
There's a caveat. He says, never will something that is beyond your power. So you've got to be very honest about your capacity to manifest that will. It isn't just simply whim, gee, I want this, or I'm going to go over there and beat people up. It's, no, I will will this because I know that I can do it, and it will be manifested. I mean, when you were saying earlier about Schopenhauer, I mean, the will is world. I mean, everything in this room is the will of somebody. It's just a frozen aspect of their will, from table design to books. And
It's the will of a lot of different kinds of
oh, yes,
people.
but not in one person. No, it's some individual who's saying, I will this.
Are the electrons running around that table conforming to your will? I mean, be serious.
I am very serious. The world is will. They're in that table, but the shape of it. If I were designing that,
the table is your perception of the light beams coming from the surface of that thing.
that's the
that's all it
receiver.
is.
But the person who conceived of that table originally had a concept of table, and he exerted that will somewhere to make sure that table became manifest. You know, maybe it was somebody forgotten, and but nevertheless, somebody's will was exerted there.
Well, let me raise another consideration. Elsewhere, Nietzsche says that living is willing, or that just to be alive is to will.
Mm-hmm.
But his definition of living was different than most definitions. He didn't consider a normal or a present day, let's say, man as being alive.
Yeah,
Well,
to suggest...
so the will, you know, one who's able to exercise his will and be a true individual and exercise his will to where he's the master of himself, that person's alive. Right. But one who isn't is not alive.
You know, the first question I had was, does he imagine that a plant is willing?
No, but he doesn't consider them alive. And
But then what are they?
well, I don't know. But I mean,
I can't think of anything more persistent than plants or nature.
Yeah, but he's using life in this regard as in an allegorical way. I mean, it's like saying you must be born again or something.
Right.
Well, we're not actually born again. I mean, physically, we might be born again emotionally and spiritually. But so he's saying that life, in that context, when he uses the word life, he means, I guess, a life worthwhile is life. A life that's not worthwhile is not life.
There's a distinction you're making between living and existing.
Yeah,
and there you go. The way I can do it is because we read here under your tutelage Introduction to Metaphysics by Heidegger a few months ago. And Heidegger traces the word being, the English being, back to early Greek, or maybe Sanskrit, maybe I had that wrong, I'm not sure, as physis. And Greek, is that physis?
Yeah.
Okay. And there's a distinction to be made between, and physis meant living in the sense of becoming and creating. That's a man. Existing is another word, which according to Heidegger anyway, and I'm sure Nietzsche is familiar with because he was a Greek scholar. And so the plant would be existing, the drudge who's a farmer, you know, just planting, and he's existing. You say, the Ubermensch, now he's in physis, he's living. You see, so there's that distinction there.
Good point.
I'd like to ask just a question to the group. Where is love in this Ubermensch, this Superman's existence or life? Does love play any part in this at all? In any kind of love? I mean, are we to even overcome love?
Well, he says that, well, one of his more provocative passages, doesn't he say that women can't love, or women can only love?
I'll look for it, Ted, while we're talking.
That's what it is.
I think it, actually, love is the key part. When you look at Nietzsche's interest, the worship of the god of wine and dance, celebration, Dionysus, that's what he was after, is a celebration of life. I was thinking that maybe this helps me illuminate at least the first part, the symbolism in the first part of the book with Zarathustra in the mountains. He's not alone, though. He's with the serpent and the eagle. And what's separating him from them, Jean Paul Sartre wrote about this. What the real difference between man and other creatures is his awareness of his own existence, his mortality. And that's what leads to our stuckness, because we lose the essence. We're more focused on existing for its own sake. We have these beautiful animals, the eagle and the serpent, and we understand them in terms of their essence. And that's what makes them so beautiful. As humankind, we're, well, at least as Jean-Paul Sartre would describe it, we're disconnected, we're aliens on this earth, because we feel very disconnected from nature. Nietzsche seeds Zarathustra right into nature, living in the mountains, living with the plants and the creatures. To come down is his moral responsibility to try to raise everybody else up. I guess that's how I see the Übermensch is actually the essence, becoming the essence.
Well, too, if you look at Übermensch as an essence that's examining, love isn't something you examine. It's something that you manifest as a result of who you are. I mean, people don't examine while they're in love. You either are or you aren't. And it's sort of like a silence and a happiness. It's not anything to be examined. It's something that's known. And that's why I think he doesn't specifically address it.
But it's there or not?
Love
I mean,
for him?
yes.
I don't think it's something he went up to the mountain to examine, but I think it's something that will manifest itself in his behavior as a result of his having accomplished, through silence and happiness, the ability to laugh and to have courage and to be able to be who he is. I think love will manifest itself, but it's certainly not something that's to be defined and examined and preached.
What about this idea of coming back down? Is that love for mankind?
It certainly manifests itself through what he can do and share with other people, as it did with that group at the end. I think he felt a level of that for them and with them as they for him. But it's not the issue. That's not what the book is about. I think the book is about the principle of how you go and you examine and then you teach. I don't think it speaks so much to love in particular. It's only inferred that it must follow if it's part of who you are.
I apologize for interrupting.
No, that's fine.
Oh, if I could just finish about Sartre. And you brought this up about nausea. Well, he's talking about when we are no longer of our essence, but more concerned about existence. Only that's how we feel going through life. You feel nauseous, and you. I thought maybe that's what.
Life has a way of doing.
There's a sick man, headaches, lasting 2 days. He can't eat spicy foods, can't sleep, and he worships the god, the Bacchae, the Dionysus, and he can't achieve it. And maybe he looks at other people. Any type of, at least in many cases, the dance is a pretense. It's a mockery, and we have to get to go across that tightrope, become more in touch with back in touch with the essence, to be able to truly dance and celebrate in the spirit of Dionysus.
What would compel somebody to want to become an Übermensch?
What's that?
We didn't hear you.
What would compel somebody to want to become an Übermensch?
You mean somebody other than Nietzsche?
Right. Like, or why does he? Like, what makes
Well,
him want to
well,
live instead of
I mean,
exist according to his definition.
Maybe you don't have a choice.
Yeah, the word Overmensch is just a word he has for the perfect man in his notion.
But I think Jesse's question is, at what moment do you say, okay, I'm too nauseated to live this way anymore, I'm going to live that way? Like, what is that moment? What is that moment?
That's what it comes to.
In someone's life, a real example even.
Well, that's what he clearly says. That's why the whole purpose of the book is to talk about being an individual, that you have to decide for yourself. There isn't an answer to that. It's something that has to come within your soul and heart. There's no guidelines.
But it is a legitimate question to say, what would prompt it? Like what kind of thing would happen?
Well, let's
to a
use him
person?
as an example. I think what prompted it is that his physical suffering was clearly impacting negatively upon his ability to work, to write. And he knew that he had to overcome that, or he couldn't do what he really wanted to do that made him happy, which was to work. Exactly. So he took this on as a personal thing for himself. And I think that's all he's suggesting other people do, is consider that you have that option. You have that option to examine yourself if you ever have an obstacle in your life, and you have the option to go through what it takes to get through it. I think that's all he's saying.
Yeah, I don't think you make a decision to do that. It's like an artist. It's simply, I have to do this. But look at the suffering. Why would I ever want to be an artist like you? Don't. I mean, if you're driven to this, yes. But by God, I mean, if you don't make a decision. Today, I'll be Picasso. I mean, Picasso is Picasso because Picasso is Picasso, and that's the end of it. He will do what he has to do, even if it means you're going to kill him. So be it. I mean, but I'm going to do my art.
Nietzsche never described himself as an Overmensch, I don't think. No. I mean, Overmensch was beyond himself even. So I think your idea that anybody can be an Overmensch if they examine,
See, I
take this
have
point
a
of
thing
view.
on
I don't think
Overmensch. I think there are 15 different interpretations in here as to what that means.
But he himself didn't claim to be an Overmensch.
Well,
That was something in the future.
Doesn't everybody in the room have sympathy for the sense that life should be lived in a healthy way, a rejection of hiding behind morals and things like that, that you should open yourself to life and be big and healthy and strong. And in that sense, everyone shares in this idea of being a Superman above the pettiness of the herd and so on and so forth.
You don't think sometimes examining your life is a painful process? I mean, and then why, if you would see somebody else going along, like maybe somebody we were talking about earlier who seems like they're given everything, they don't need to suffer, so they don't have that moment, they don't have the natural questioning, and you have envy for that and the simplicity there, and maybe they're not the Übermensch, but maybe they're happier. I mean, is that not considered? I mean, the whole idea of examining seems like, and breaking the tablet seems like
Let me answer the question. Of course, you may suffer. But the fact of the matter is, you shouldn't be afraid of this. Of course there are dangers in the world, but you shouldn't be afraid of them. You shouldn't withdraw from the world to caress some humility or things like that. You should recognize these things are open. There's part of life, and it's part of being living and strong. And those are the things that are celebrated by a Superman and by a...
This is the antithesis of what that book's all about, by the way, what you're saying.
Really? Show me.
Well, he's saying just that's the whole thing is you do have to go and examine. What do you mean you don't have to be afraid? He's scared shitless. I mean, through the whole process, he's nauseous. He goes through it himself. He's not suggesting that you should be brave.
I think the average person
Well, he's
has no
suggesting you come
desire
out
to
with
do that
courage.
at all. I think the average person has no desire to examine his life
Absolutely.
or anything. I don't know. Maybe you live in a very wonderful place, but maybe I'm jaded. But the masses of people that I've seen,
What's wrong with
no, I didn't say anything wrong. I'm simply
But you
saying
are. That's a judgment. You just judge.
that they don't wish to examine.
Maybe you live in a perfect world where they do,
Oh,
and I
no.
don't. I live in this world where they don't.
I was thinking. I wasn't trying to judge in a large sense, but just go on.
But when he refers to the rabble, wouldn't people who live day to day struggling to find shelter and food, isn't that really living? Or I mean, that's like the
To
basic
Nietzsche?
things to exist.
To Nietzsche, no.
No, I'm saying,
No. Oh, to me?
She's saying for the
Absolutely
what
not.
I'm saying is, can that in some ways be more real than, breaking tablets?
Well, remember Aristotle it says in a very famous phrase, once you don't have to worry about lions chasing you and where you're going to get food and how you can get out of the weather, then maybe you can think about philosophy. But not before that. We're just lucky in my day, Aristotle says, that all our needs are met and we live in such a comfortable way that I can think about philosophy.
Why would you want to think about philosophy if you don't have food?
And the question is right. And the question is, can we become our fullest selves if
You
we
think
have...
about philosophy, not wade through the water and all? Don't you sort of have to take care of the body a little bit?
And is Nietzsche maybe saying, are we too comfortable now? Now is it way, way too easy not to think about philosophy all over again because we are so very comfortable?
Yeah, we're halfway to philosophy. We're Philistines.
With all the
addictions, all the denials that we live, all the stuff we collect to hide from ourselves.
Yeah.
I think philosophy is so.
Could be very dangerous.
I think people do think philosophic questions today if they allow themselves, but there are a lot of distractions out there.
Yep.
Computer games, alcohol, drugs, stuff to collect.
But you're talking about the evils of the society, but I think she's talking about the individuals.
I'm
There's
saying the
many
individual
individuals.
chooses
Yeah.
Within the
denial
society.
through the toys.
Well, that's the point, though. They do have to choose. It's easy not to have to choose because you don't have to choose. There's enough distractions that you don't
So I'm
need to
saying
go to philosophy.
if we consider ourselves so comfortable, but is this serving us? Could we choose philosophy and perhaps be more inwardly together and
Well,
happier?
sure, but it's an individual thing. That's all. It's not a societal question, I don't think.
We can't choose that the United States will be the philosophical, self-examining society. It doesn't work that way.
Then you've got Plato's Republic.
Right.
And I don't want that.
Marx.
I don't know about you.
No poets there. No poets in Plato's
That's
Republic.
right.
Using today's vernacular, would anybody consider this to be a self-help book?
Yeah, sure. Probably.
Yes.
Yeah.
Large S, yes.
No, I don't think it is because self-help gives you steps how to get there. He really doesn't. He really says you got to figure out your own way to get there. Self-help usually has, this and then this and then this. I don't think it
Does he
self-help.
make you want to figure it out after you finish it?
Yeah,
I think
but it's
that's
not the
self-help.
same as self-help.
Well, if somebody was confused about life or had certain questions, would this be a good book to go to get answers?
No.
No,
It would just make you feel more upset that you don't know where you're going.
It won't make it on the Oprah show. I guarantee you.
didn't read this very well, did you?
I think
I sure did.
It
A number
does
of times.
model bringing up repressions and the taboos that maybe you're inhibited from facing about
Maybe a really good
oneself.
self-help
So in that
book.
sense,
I mean, he came
That's
off the mountain purposely to teach.
yeah,
Right?
sure. He doesn't give you steps, but he does model, yeah.
I
Yeah,
think
but
we
do
should
you-
go to the self-help section and see how many of those books start out by telling us that God is dead. Forget all
We
this
have to
stuff.
create ourselves, right?
I think I remember the theme song being "Thus Spoke Zarathustra."
That was by Richard Strauss, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It had nothing much to do with Nietzsche. I mean, it was. I did see the movie many years ago, but Strauss wrote a piece which was clearly inspired. He was inspired by Zarathustra. I wouldn't be able to give you a commentary on the piece out of the text, however.
But I guess my question was, who is Zarathustra?
That's a different matter.
And how does this all fit?
Right. Zarathustra, the figure, is historically a Persian who is reputed to have been the father of moral philosophy. We could put it that way. Philosophy is a bit formal. He was the father of morality, according to that tradition. And Nietzsche chooses him as a prophet of a new morality, which Nietzsche personally is in the process of developing, you see. So Zarathustra is symbolic of the beginning and the end of the long tradition of the Middle East and Western Europe, the long tradition of morality, which Nietzsche is now going to transcend. One of Nietzsche's most famous and I think best books, which he wrote as an attempt to explain Zarathustra, which people found difficult to understand, is called Beyond Good and Evil. Now, the phrase means not that Nietzsche is an immoralist, but that he is an amoralist with respect to the tradition. That is to say, beyond good and evil lies a superior version of goodness and evil. So Zarathustra is a kind of symbolic figure for a shift that is coming. Zarathustra is a prophet of a new morality. And the morality, of course, is the one that Nietzsche articulates sometimes mysteriously, but sometimes with great power in Zarathustra.
Go back to Nietzsche as a person. Again, what year was he born?
1844.
And do you remember his exact age when he died?
He died in 1900, but he had been mad for a good 10 years before that.
Where was he kept for those 11 years that he was, or 10 years?
Well, most of the time he was kept at home by his sister, who took care of him. I can't tell you exactly where. He must have died in a hospital. I happened to see his death head in Stockholm. It's very impressive, but I honestly don't remember, where he died. But that was his life was quite tragic. He suffered really from his mid-20s, early 20s, from terrible vision, serious migraine headaches, nausea, and yet he produced 30 or 35 volumes of really gorgeous prose, very deep prose. Always ill, and at the age of 45, he went mad in Italy. And his sister got a hold of him and took him home and took care of him for the remaining 10 years of his life.
Was he married?
No. His relationship with women is not clearly known. I mean, the assumption is that he was entirely chaste, never had any relations with women. He seemed clearly to be in love with a woman named Lou Salome, who also wrote a book about him, a woman of some interest in her own right. But they had intense, it was a kind of a platonic love affair as far as we know. They had intense philosophical discussions. Otherwise, Nietzsche lived a life of almost total solitude. I mean, he spent his life moving from one furnished room to another, changing location in accord with his very bad health, always looking for a place where he could breathe more easily, and time, taken up by traveling or studying in various places in Europe and the United States. Then I retired in '93 and took a chair at Boston University, where I now am. I'm the Borden Parker Bown Professor of Philosophy and a university professor at Boston University.
How often can we find you in the classroom?
I teach a full load. John Silber, who, as you know, is still the chancellor of BU, wisely, I think, insists that the senior people teach. That's honored. There are one or two exceptions of famous poets or novelists. But the academic people teach a full program, which is 2 courses. And one is a graduate seminar that meets for 3 hours a week. The other is an undergraduate course. As it happens, I'm teaching Nietzsche's Zarathustra this semester. They're largely honor students, about 15 or 20, and that takes 3 hours a week. So it's 6 hours of teaching, plus all the time I spend with my graduate students, reading their dissertations, preparing for classes, and so on.
What do you notice about the undergrad students when they come into the classroom? At what point do they start to understand this stuff?
Again, that depends on the kind of student. If we're talking about the large 150-person classroom, in fact, I've had as many as 350 in a classroom. There, the problem is extremely serious because there are so many people that it's hard to focus their attention. They come from very diverse backgrounds. For most of these kids, philosophy is a 3-hour requirement in humanities. Many of them not at all interested, and they have to be made interested, and the only way to do that is by translating the material into ordinary language, which goes directly to the roots of their daily lives. How deeply those roots go will depend upon how well they respond. So that's one group of students, and I've had some luck with these people. In particular, I found teaching a novel like Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, which is in a way closely connected with some of the themes, although it takes different positions, closely connected with some of the themes in Zarathustra. The real joy, however, is in teaching the kind of course that I'm giving right now, to what is essentially a group of honor students, say 20 honor students, who are there because they want to be there. They, in effect, begged me to put them. It was admission by instructor only. And this is wonderful, because they're bright, highly intelligent, imaginative, eager to learn. They want to be there. And if I may say so, this might sound peculiar to our audience, they don't know anything. That means that their brains are not obstructed by professionalism, as sometimes happens with senior students or graduate students. They don't already know everything. They don't already have a rich culture. They don't already have a familiarity with the 10 or 15 different interpretations of Nietzsche. And so we can get right down to business and excite them, you know, in a way like in a Platonic dialogue, in which Socrates is talking to young boys who are highly intelligent, and simply they're at that age in which they want to know what it is to be a human being, what is life all about, that kind of thing. So that's very exciting, but that's quite a different experience from the teaching of you know, large introductory classes.
You keep mentioning Zarathustra, and I have here Modern Library Series, Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Yeah.
Fill in a couple blanks for me, and I admit to not having paid a great deal of attention, but the movie came out 2001, Odyssey, years ago, and
be freed of his nausea. It was a lonely existence, but one which was spiritually as rich as that of anyone I know in the last 200 years.
Well, if he wrote 35 volumes of material, how much of that do we know sold back then?
Well, Nietzsche didn't sell much at first, but he soon became rather popular, and especially after the, you know, when he was, the 10 years or so when he was already mad, people from all over Europe were beginning to, intelligent and highly artistic people were beginning to discover Nietzsche. His influence grew steadily throughout the first half of the 20th century. I mean, people like D.H. Lawrence, the English novelist, G.B. Shaw, Man and Superman, you know that play, Strindberg, Thomas Mann, the German novelist who moved to the States. Really, the list of people influenced by Nietzsche is endless. Even Sigmund Freud, who denied, incidentally, he denied having studied Nietzsche, clearly was influenced by Nietzsche and borrowed a number of notions from him. So one could say that Nietzsche's influence exploded all over Western Europe, certainly Russia, and North and South America.
You know, if you get on Amazon.com, and put in the name Stanley Rosen, you come up with, oh, I don't know, at least 23 different items.
Some of them are written by an imposter who's a specialist in Chinese studies. In other words, there's another Stanley Rosen.
But the point I wanted to make, though, is that you've written a lot, and I've got one of your books here, The Mask of Enlightenment,
yes,
which is about Nietzsche's Zarathustra.
Correct.
When did you write this?
The book is a consequence of lectures, graduate seminars that I have been giving on Nietzsche on and off for, oh, I don't know, 20 years. But I actually sat down and put the manuscript together in 1993.
Is it available still? People want to buy it?
Oh, yes. It's published by Cambridge University Press and is easily available.
Now, if you know, let's say 150 years from now, people are looking around and they say, oh, there's this Stanley Rosen, the philosopher. Well, is there a Rosen philosophy?
No, not in the sense that I suspect you mean it. I am not one who has built up a system which purports to give the principles of all things, and nor am I in a happy position of being able to clear up all the mysteries of human life. My philosophy, if you want to call it that, is really inspired most by the Platonic Socrates. I'm a man who, like many others, has devoted his life to examining fundamental questions, fundamental principles, and trying to understand how these fundamental principles have been spelled out in the history of philosophy, and the shape that they've taken in our own time, and what they, you know, every age has crises. We have our crises, and I've tried to find my bearings and to help my students to find their bearings with respect to these philosophical crises. So in short, many of my books, not all, but many of my books are about somebody else. I've written books about Plato or Hegel or Nietzsche. I've written books about Heidegger and so on. And that's not because I'm a pure philologist or scholar, but because I believe that philosophy must be studied in the context of its development.
Dr. Stanley Rosen of Boston University is in Boston, and we are in Washington, and we're going to have another one of those informal conversations we had a number of months ago when we talked to Dr. Rosen about Plato. This time, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, tell me, who are we talking about so we can get the correct pronunciation from you?
Friedrich Nietzsche.
Who was he?
Nietzsche was one of the most extraordinary thinkers and writers of the second half of the 19th century, born in Germany in 1844. He had a relatively brief, productive lifetime. He went mad when he was approximately 45 years old and died in 1900. So we could call him an extraordinary influential thinker and one of the truly great prose writers of German, certainly in the 19th century. That would be my first reply to your question.
And how much have you thought and written about him in your life?
Well, actually, I first started reading Nietzsche when I was an adolescent. And in fact, in my day, that would be more than 50 years ago, Nietzsche was not studied really in philosophy departments and was regarded as a kind of a mad poet rather than a serious thinker. That's interesting because I've kept reading Nietzsche for the next 50 years, and finally his influence caught up with me here in the United States, and he's now one of the most widely read, most influential thinkers of our time. And books pour from the presses on Nietzsche, really quite unusual. So he's had a tremendous impact in the second half of the 20th century in the United States.
Why do you think?
Well, for several reasons. First of all, he's a man of extraordinarily powerful rhetoric. Some people would find the prose in Zarathustra a bit too flowery and passionate. It's written in the style of Luther's translation of the Bible. But his other works are extraordinarily beautiful and really extraordinarily articulate. That's the first reason, his great prowess as a writer. Secondly, however, Nietzsche states in the most powerful way a criticism of the modern epoch, and in particular late modernity, and still more precisely the latter end of the Enlightenment. He states with the greatest power a criticism of that epoch, which has now become rather fashionable. There's a big fight going on, and has been going on almost since the beginning of the Enlightenment, as to whether it was ultimately good or bad. And it would be going too far to say that for Nietzsche it's all bad, but Nietzsche takes the view that what looks to others like progress, scientific progress, technological progress, materialism, egalitarianism, the spread of democracy, even the advent of National Socialist, I don't mean by that the Nazis, of course, socialist parties, many people regard that as great progress. Nietzsche saw it as great decadence. And this quarrel within the heart of the Enlightenment is one that has been articulated in the most powerful way by Nietzsche. So if I could add, Brian, one last point that occurs to me. Nietzsche is a prophet of revolution. And to define exactly the content of the revolution that he advocates is not so easy. But one thing that is clear is that Nietzsche is preaching a destruction of traditional values, in particular the values of the Christian tradition, and secondly, but with considerable importance, the values of the Greek philosophers. Nietzsche preaches creativity, originality, uniqueness, self-overcoming, and these have all become extremely popular notions in the 20th century. Think of all the liberation movements in our time. I mean, the black liberation, women's liberation, gay liberation, all the revolutions by young people, which you and I will still remember from, if I'm not giving you too many years, from the Vietnam times. People who wanted to break loose from society, break loose from tradition, reject Christianity, reject the sterility of the middle class and of the bourgeois society, all turned to Nietzsche for solace and for inspiration. Whether he intended to give inspiration to these diverse groups, that's another question. But those are some of the main reasons why Nietzsche is so popular today.
The impetus for asking you to join us again is a Richard Hall, C-SPAN Richard Hall produced event at Bibelow's bookstore near Baltimore in Timonium, where the Philosophy Book Club meets once a month, and at the end of our discussion we'll show that discussion among everyday citizens talking about philosophy. Let me ask you just a general question. What is the value to people who are adults sitting around talking about philosophy?
Well, now that's a rather difficult question to answer in a simple way. I would say for some people there's no value at all. But those would have to be extremely thoughtless people who are, we're going to exclude them from this discussion. The group that I saw, I looked at parts of the tape, obviously consisted of very bright, concerned people who were interested in understanding themselves and therefore in understanding the structure of the historical period that produced them. And in particular, they were clearly intrigued by the extraordinary power, and I should say ambiguity of Nietzsche's writings. So, in other words, an intellectual treat, a sheer pleasure, and an essential element in the process that characterizes us as a species, and that is that we want to try to figure out what it means to be a human being and how to live one's life, whether that be the life of a carpenter or an electrician or a physicist or a philosopher is really irrelevant. Ultimately, man, I think, if I may say so, is the philosophical animal. And so in considering philosophy, we are simply exercising our common humanity.
For those who missed our earlier discussion on Plato, would you mind going over the details on Dr. Stanley Rosen? Give us a little background. How long have you mentioned earlier about 50 years of teaching?
Well, it's 50 years of studying philosophy, yeah. I'm a graduate of the old Hutchins College of the University of Chicago, and I went on from there to take my doctorate with the Committee on Social Thought, a very well-known interdisciplinary program that has had many famous people in its faculty. And then I studied in Greece for a year. My wife was an archaeologist at that time. Then came to Penn State University, where I spent 38 years with a lot of time